Carl Jung explained 10 spiritual clues that your soul is ready for higher love. There's a secret about love that no one tells you, a truth so profound, so psychologically disruptive, that it remains hidden in plain sight, while millions of people cycle through the same patterns, wondering why love keeps failing them. And here it is. Every relationship you've had until now, every connection that fizzled, every partnership that imploded, every person you thought was the one until they weren't. These didn't fail because you chose the wrong person. They failed because your soul wasn't ready for what you were seeking. I know that sounds impossible. We've been conditioned to believe that love is about finding the right person, being in the right place at the right time, looking attractive enough, being successful enough, having the right chemistry. We've been taught that love is external, something we find out there in the world. But Carl Jung understood something that challenges everything we've been told. He said, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But here's what he didn't say explicitly, what he left for those willing to go deeper to discover. Transformation-capable love requires transformed individuals. You cannot sustain alchemical love with an alchemical soul. You cannot hold sacred union without internal preparation. The love you've been seeking, the kind that doesn't just entertain but transforms, that doesn't just distract but heals, that doesn't just feel good but awakens something eternal within you, this love has been impossible because you weren't ready for it. And I don't mean you weren't good enough. I don't mean you were broken or unworthy or needed to become more attractive, more successful, more perfect. I mean your psyche hadn't completed the internal preparation that makes higher love possible. Your soul was still operating from ego structures that could only support ego love, relationships built on need, completion fantasies, projection, unconscious patterns, and the desperate hope that another person would fill the void within you. But something has been happening to you, something you may not have fully understood until now. You've been experiencing mysterious internal shifts that felt like dissolution. Old patterns that used to drive you towards certain types of people have suddenly lost their power. The desperate need for relationship that once consumed you has transformed into something else. Not apathy, not fear, but a strange readiness that doesn't chase or cling. You've spent time alone, not avoiding intimacy, but actively choosing yourself. And that solitude did something to you. It changed you at a level deeper than behavior or belief. It prepared your soul. You've noticed that romantic fantasies no longer captivate you the way they used to. When you meet someone attractive, you don't immediately project a fantasy, future onto them. You see them, actually see them, and this clarity feels both disappointing and profoundly liberating. You've discovered parts of yourself you were taught to hide, dark aspects you were conditioned to deny, and instead of remaining in shame, you've begun integrating these shadows into your sense of self. You've stopped splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable, light and dark, good and bad. You've become more whole. And in this wholeness, something unexpected happened. You stopped seeking completion, the aching emptiness that used to drive you toward other people, hoping they would fill you, fix you, make you feel worthy. That emptiness has transformed into fullness. Not the fullness of having everything you want, but the fullness of being at home in yourself. And from that fullness, a new desire has emerged. Not the desperate need for someone to complete you, but the natural wish to share your overflow with another whole being. These shifts, and others we'll explore, aren't random. They aren't signs that you're becoming cynical, jaded, or incapable of love. They're signs that you're standing at a threshold most people never reach. You're becoming capable of what Jung called the Coniunctio, the sacred marriage. Not just the external marriage of two people, but the internal marriage of opposites within your own psyche, and the conscious union that becomes possible when two people who've completed this internal work meet each other. This is forbidden knowledge in a culture that profits from keeping you in surface-level relationships. Everything you've been taught about finding love, the apps, the techniques, the self-improvement promises, the perfect timing, is designed to keep you in ego love. Relationships that entertain but don't transform. Connections that feel good but don't threaten your ego structures. Partnerships that maintain your illusions rather than destroy and rebuild you. But higher love, soul-level union, doesn't work like that. It requires preparation, psychological preparation, spiritual preparation, the kind of work most people never do because it's too difficult, too confronting, too much like dying while you're still alive. Jung understood this. He studied medieval alchemical texts, not as chemistry, but as maps of psychological transformation, and he discovered that the alchemists weren't actually trying to turn lead into gold. They were describing the transformation of the unconscious, fragmented psyche into the conscious, integrated self. And more than that, they were teaching that this internal alchemy was the prerequisite for the external alchemy of sacred relationship. You cannot skip this preparation. You cannot bypass the internal work and still access higher love. It's not possible. It's like trying to run before you can walk, or trying to hold water in hands that haven't yet formed. The container must be built first. The soul must be prepared. And if you're experiencing the shifts I described, the death of fantasy and projection, the completion of Solitude's teaching, the integration of shadow, the withdrawal of unconscious patterns, these aren't signs of becoming unlovable. They're signs that the container is being built. Your soul is being prepared. And here's what no one tells you. This preparation is rare. Most people never complete it. They spend their entire lives moving from relationship to relationship, unconsciously seeking the same thing in different faces, hoping that maybe this time, this person, this connection will finally provide what they've been missing. But it never does. Not because they chose wrong, but because ego love cannot satisfy soul hunger. The relationships fail not because of incompatibility or bad timing, but because neither person was ready for the transformation that higher love demands. But you're different now. You've been through something. You've dissolved and reformed. You've faced aspects of yourself that others spend lifetimes avoiding. You've spent time in the wilderness of solitude and emerged with gifts. You've stopped expecting another person to save you, complete you, or make you feel worthy. And in that release of expectation, you've become capable of something most people only romanticize but never experience. There are 10 specific clues, 10 psychological markers that signal your soul is ready for higher love. These aren't surface-level changes like feeling more confident or knowing what you want in a partner. These are deep structural shifts in how your psyche operates, how you relate to yourself and others, how you hold projection and reality, need and wholeness, merger and autonomy. These clues prove that you've undergone what Jung considered the work of the second half of life, the shift from ego building to self-realization, from external seeking to internal wholeness, from unconscious relating to conscious union. If you're experiencing these clues, you're not just ready to date again. You're not just healed from past relationships. You're ready for love as psychological alchemy, love as mutual individuation, love as sacred union between two beings who've done the hardest work, becoming themselves, and now choose to create something greater than either could alone. This isn't the love you learned about in movies or songs. This isn't the completion fantasy that culture sells. This is the love Jung spent his life trying to articulate, the Coniunctio, the sacred marriage, the union of opposites that transforms both people, because both people have transformed themselves first. It's the love that doesn't just feel good, but makes you more fully yourself. the love that doesn't complete you but celebrates your completeness, the love that doesn't heal your wounds but witnesses your self-healing, the love that doesn't save you but honors that you saved yourself, and your soul is ready for it. The question now is, can you recognize the signs? Can you see that everything you've been through, all the dissolution, all the solitude, all the shadow work, all the pattern breaking, has been preparation for this? Can you trust that you're standing at a threshold most people never reach, and that the love awaiting you on the other side is nothing like what you experienced before? Over the next 3 hours, we're going to explore the 10 clues in depth. We're going to understand not just what they are, but why they matter, what they mean psychologically, and how they prepare you for sacred union. We're going to dive into Jung's vision of relationship as alchemy, and we're going to discover that you haven't been unlucky in love. You've been preparing for a love that your previous self could never sustain. This is going to challenge you. It's going to ask you to examine your past relationships with brutal honesty. It's going to require you to acknowledge that much of what you called love before was actually projection, need, pattern repetition, and unconscious psychological material. It's going to confront you with the reality that higher love isn't easier or more comfortable. It's harder, more demanding, more transformative. But it's also more real, more sustaining, more capable of withstanding the full truth of who you both are. So if you're ready, if you've felt these mysterious shifts within yourself and wondered what they mean, if you've noticed that your relationship to love itself has fundamentally changed, if you're standing at this threshold between who you were and who you're becoming, then keep watching. Because what we're about to explore isn't just information, it's initiation, not into a club or a teaching, but into a level of consciousness about love that most people never access. You are not here by accident. Your soul brought you here because it's ready for higher love. And everything you've been through has been preparing you for what comes next. Let's begin. Before we explore the 10 clues that signal your readiness for higher love, we need to understand exactly what Jung meant by sacred relationship, psychological union, and the Coniunctio. Because without this foundation, the clues won't make sense. They'll seem like random personal growth markers rather than what they actually are, stages in a profound alchemical process that transforms lead into gold, unconsciousness into consciousness, ego-love into soul union. Jung didn't arrive at his understanding of sacred relationship through romantic idealism or spiritual fantasy. He discovered it through decades of studying medieval alchemical texts. Now, most people dismissed these ancient manuscripts as primitive chemistry, early scientists trying unsuccessfully to turn base metals into gold. But Jung saw something else entirely. He recognized that the alchemists were encoding psychological wisdom in chemical metaphors. They weren't actually trying to transform physical substances. They were describing the transformation of the psyche, the process by which an unconscious, fragmented, shadow-ridden person becomes conscious, integrated, and whole. And hidden within these alchemical texts was something even more profound: the realization that this internal transformation was the prerequisite for external sacred union, that the marriage of opposites within the individual psyche, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow, had to occur before the external marriage between two individuals could become transformative rather than merely transactional. Jung called this internal marriage the Coniunctio, the sacred union of opposites, and he understood that most of what we call love never reaches this level. Most relationships operate from what he called participation mystique, an unconscious identification where neither person has individuated, where both are projecting their own unintegrated psychic content onto each other, where the relationship exists to serve ego needs rather than soul development. Let me show you what this looks like through a story. Elizabeth and Michael met in their late 30s. By conventional standards, both had failed at love. Multiple previous relationships, divorces, years of therapy. But something was different about each of them now. They'd both spent the previous 5 years doing deep psychological work, shadow integration, pattern recognition, inner masculine and feminine development. When they met, neither was desperate for partnership. Neither was projecting completion fantasies. Neither needed the other to fill an internal void. Their first date was strange by normal standards. They didn't perform or impress. They didn't present their best selves or hide their difficulties. They met as two people who'd done the hard work of becoming themselves, curious about who the other actually was. And what unfolded over the following months was a relationship operating according to completely different principles than anything either had experienced before. When conflict arose, and it did, neither person needed the other to be different. They could hold the tension without rescuing or fixing. When shadows emerged, and they did, neither person was shocked or disappointed. They could witness each other's darkness without trying to force it back underground. When intimacy deepened, and it did, neither person lost themselves in merger. They could be profoundly connected while remaining completely separate. This is what Jung meant by psychological relationship, not the unconscious fusion most people call love, but the conscious union between two individuated beings. And it's only possible after a specific alchemical process has occurred within each person. The alchemists described this process in 4 stages, and Jung recognized these stages as a map of psychological transformation. First came the nigredo, the blackening, the dissolution, the dark night of the soul. This is the stage where your ego structures begin to break down. Everything you thought you were, everything you built your identity around, everything you used to maintain your sense of self. It starts dissolving. Your masks stop working. Your strategies stop protecting you. Your certainties become questions. This stage is excruciating because it feels like death, and in a sense, it is. The death of the false self, the constructed identity, the defended ego. Most people never make it through the nigredo because they interpret this dissolution as failure rather than transformation. They rush back into relationship to escape the darkness, or they construct new ego defenses to avoid the pain. But if you can stay in the nigredo, if you can allow the dissolution without fleeing or defending, something miraculous happens. The false self dies and space opens for the true self to emerge. Second came the albedo, the whitening, the purification, the dawn after darkness. This is the stage of shadow work. All the rejected, repressed, denied parts of yourself that were driving your behavior unconsciously. Now they come into the light. Your capacity for manipulation, cruelty, selfishness, need. Your dark sexual impulses, your power hunger, your hidden jealousies and resentments. Everything you've been taught to hide, everything you've denied about yourself to maintain your good self-image. Now you have to face it, acknowledge it, integrate it. This stage isn't about becoming more moral or acceptable. It's about becoming more whole, accepting that you contain both light and darkness, both creation and destruction, both care and cruelty. Jung said, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The albedo is where that consciousness happens, and it's brutal, because you have to give up your idealized self-image, your claim to being purely good, your righteousness and innocence. You have to acknowledge that you're capable of everything you've judged in others. But if you can do this work, if you can integrate your shadow without being destroyed by shame, you become psychologically whole in a way that transforms everything. Third came the citrinitas, the yellowing, the dawning awareness, the emergence of consciousness. This is the stage where you begin to see clearly. The projections start falling away. The patterns become visible. The unconscious material that was driving your behavior becomes conscious. You start recognizing your complexes, understanding your wounds, seeing how your past has been determining your present. This is the stage of insight, of clarity, of sudden understanding. It's like waking up from a dream and realizing that much of what you thought was reality was actually psychological projection. Your parents' issues that you've been unconsciously repeating. Your childhood wounds that have been engineering your adult relationships. The internal masculine or feminine that you've been projecting onto external partners. All of it becomes visible. And with this visibility comes choice. For the first time, you're not just being driven by unconscious forces. You can see them, name them, choose differently. Fourth and finally came the rubedo, the reddening, the sacred marriage, the coniunctio. This is the stage where the opposites unite within you, masculine and feminine, conscious and unconscious, light and shadow. They marry each other inside your psyche. You become internally whole. Not perfect, not without struggle, but integrated in a way that allows you to hold contradiction, paradox, and complexity without fragmenting. And from this internal wholeness, a new capacity emerges. The capacity for external sacred union. The capacity to meet another individuated being and create something that transforms you both without destroying either of you. This is the alchemical process. And Jung understood that most relationships never touch it because most people never complete the first three stages. They skip straight to trying to create external union without doing the internal work. And it's impossible. It's like trying to mix chemicals that haven't been properly prepared. There might be some reaction, attraction, chemistry, intensity, but it won't be transformative. It will be destructive or disappointing or simply superficial. The crucial distinction Jung made was between what he called participation mystique and psychological relationship. Participation mystique is the unconscious identification that characterizes most romantic connections. It's what happens when two people who haven't individuated meet each other. Neither person really sees the other as they actually are. Instead, they're projecting their own unconscious material onto each other. The man projects his anima, his inner feminine, onto the woman, falling in love with his own psychic content while believing it's her. The woman projects her animus, her inner masculine, onto the man, seeking externally what she hasn't developed internally. They merge into each other, lose themselves in the relationship, operate as a fused unit rather than two separate individuals. This merger feels like love. It feels like finally finding your other half, your soulmate, the person who completes you. But it's actually unconsciousness masquerading as connection, and it always leads to disappointment because eventually the projections collapse. You start seeing the real person rather than your projection, and they're not who you thought they were. Or you become resentful because they're not meeting the unconscious needs you projected onto them. Or you lose yourself so completely in the merger that you don't know who you are anymore. Psychological relationship is completely different. It requires that both people have individuated, completed the alchemical process of becoming whole within themselves. When two individuated beings meet, they don't merge. They remain separate while choosing conscious union. They can see each other clearly. Without projection, they can hold space for each other's full humanity, light and shadow, strength and weakness, wholeness and woundedness. They don't need each other to complete them because they're already complete. They choose each other not from need, but from overflow. Jung said it this way: seldom or never does a marriage develop into an individual relationship smoothly and without crises. There is no birth of consciousness without pain. This is what separates ego love from soul love. Ego love seeks comfort, stability, predictability. It wants the other person to confirm your worldview, fulfill your needs, and not challenge your ego structures. Soul love embraces discomfort as the edge of growth. It welcomes the challenges because they're the alchemical heat that transforms both people. I need to be vulnerable with you here because this teaching isn't theoretical for me. I spent my 20s and early 30s in what I would have called loving relationships. I believed I was capable of love. I believed I was choosing well. But when I look back now with Jung's framework, I can see that every single one of those relationships was participation mystique. I was projecting my anima onto partners, seeking them to provide emotional depth I hadn't developed in myself. I was unconsciously repeating my mother's patterns, choosing people who would reenact childhood wounds so I could finally heal them. I was using relationships to avoid facing my shadow, to maintain my idealized self-image, to escape the terror of being alone with myself. And every relationship failed, not because I chose wrong partners, but because I wasn't ready for psychological relationship. My psyche hadn't completed the alchemical preparation. I hadn't gone through the nigredo, the dissolution of my ego structures. I hadn't done the albedo, the shadow integration work. I hadn't experienced the citrinitas, the dawning awareness of my patterns and projections. I was trying to create the rubedo, the sacred marriage, without having done any of the prerequisite work. It took years of solitude, therapy, shadow work, and brutal self-honesty before I understood what Jung was teaching. Love isn't something you find. It's something you become capable of, and that capacity requires psychological preparation that most people never complete. Here's what most self-help about relationships gets wrong. They tell you to work on your communication skills, learn to express your needs, choose better partners, recognize red flags, heal your attachment wounds, and sure, those things might help you have more functional relationships, but they don't prepare you for higher love. They don't address the fundamental psychological structures that determine what kind of love you can sustain. Because the truth is this: your relationships reflect your level of psychological development. If you haven't integrated your shadow, you'll keep attracting partners who carry your disowned darkness. If you haven't developed your inner masculine or feminine, you'll keep seeking partners to provide what you haven't cultivated internally. If you haven't individuated, you'll keep creating participation mystique relationships that feel intense but can't sustain real intimacy. Jung called this the mirror effect, and it's simultaneously confronting and liberating. Confronting because it means you can't blame your relationship failures on bad luck or wrong partners. Every person you've been with was reflecting your psychological state at that time. They were showing you what you needed to work on, what you hadn't integrated, what you were projecting. Liberating because it means you have complete agency. You don't need to wait for the right person to appear. You need to become the person capable of higher love. This is why the 10 clues matter. They're not arbitrary markers of readiness. They're evidence that you've undergone the alchemical process, that you've moved through the nigredo, worked through the albedo, experienced the citrinitas, and are approaching the rubedo. They prove that your psyche has been preparing itself for psychological relationship rather than participation mystique. And here's what Jung understood: that changes everything. When two people who've completed this preparation meet each other, something miraculous becomes possible. Not the merger that destroys individuality, but the union that celebrates it. Not the completion fantasy that inevitably disappoints, but the conscious partnership that continually transforms. Not the romantic projection that must collapse, but the psychological reality that sustains. The alchemists had a phrase for the vessel where transformation occurred, the vias hermeticum, the hermetically sealed container. In physical alchemy, this was the flask where base metals would be heated and transformed. In psychological alchemy, Jung understood that relationship itself becomes the sealed container, the protected space where two individuals undergo mutual transformation, but only if both have done the work. Only if both have moved through the stages. Only if both are ready for what the alchemists called the chemical wedding, the union of opposites that creates something entirely new. Elizabeth and Michael discovered this. Their relationship became a container for mutual individuation. When Michael's shadow surfaced, his tendency toward withdrawal and emotional unavailability, Elizabeth didn't try to fix him or make him wrong. She could hold space for his darkness because she'd integrated her own. When Elizabeth's wounds showed up, her fear of abandonment and need for constant reassurance, Michael didn't become her therapist or her savior. He could witness her pain without needing to rescue her because he'd learned to hold his own wounds. They used conflict not to prove who was right, but to see what was unconscious. They treated triggers as information about what still needed integration. They supported each other's growth even when it created temporary distance. They held the alchemical vessel of their relationship sacred, understanding that the discomfort was the heat necessary for transformation. This is what Jung meant by the Coniunctio, not the romantic fantasy of finding your other half, but the psychological reality of two whole beings choosing sacred union, and it's only possible after you've completed the internal work. So as we move into exploring the 10 clues, understand that each one represents a stage in this alchemical process. Each one proves that your psyche is preparing for something most people never experience. Each one signals that you're becoming capable of love as transformation rather than transaction, as alchemy rather than arrangement, as sacred union rather than ego fulfillment. The question isn't whether you'll find the right person. The question is whether you've become the person ready for psychological relationship. And these 10 clues reveal the answer. Let's discover them together. The first clue that your soul is ready for higher love arrives as a death. Not a physical death, but a psychological one that feels equally final and equally transformative. Romantic fantasy, the intoxicating ability to project idealized images onto potential partners, to imagine perfect futures with virtual strangers, to fall in love with your own creation rather than the person in front of you, suddenly collapses. And in its absence, you discover something simultaneously disappointing and profoundly liberating. You can finally see people as they actually are. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's 34, sitting across from a man at a coffee shop on their first date. He's objectively attractive, tall, successful, charming in that easy way that usually makes her heart race. 2 years ago, she would have been constructing a fantasy right now, imagining their life together, the house they'd buy, the trips they'd take, how he'd look in a suit at their wedding. She would have been falling in love not with him, but with her projection of who she needed him to be. But something's different now. As he talks about his work, his interests, his recent breakup, Sarah is actually listening. She's seeing him, his actual personality, his real limitations, his genuine qualities. And strangely, this clarity doesn't produce the usual romantic excitement. There's no fantasy spinning out of control, no projection of her inner ideal onto his physical form. There's just this person, interesting but flawed, attractive but real. And Sarah realizes with a strange mix of disappointment and relief, she's seeing truth instead of fantasy, and she can't go back. This is the death of projection, and it's one of the most significant psychological shifts that prepares you for higher love. To understand why this matters so profoundly, we need to explore Jung's teaching on projection, the unconscious mechanism that dominates most of what we call romantic love. Projection is the process by which we experience our own unconscious psychic content as though it exists in the external world. We see our own inner material reflected in other people, events, and circumstances, but we believe we're seeing something that belongs to them rather than to us. Jung discovered that projection isn't occasional or accidental. It's constant and automatic. We're always projecting. The question is whether we're aware of it or not. In romantic love, projection operates at maximum intensity. When a man meets a woman and feels that sudden, overwhelming attraction, that sensation of, this is her, the one I've been looking for, what's actually happening is that his anima, his inner feminine, has been projected onto her. He's not seeing her at all. He's seeing his own unconscious feminine nature externalized, and the intensity of his feeling is proportional to how much of his own psyche he's encountering through her form. Similarly, when a woman meets a man and feels that magnetic pull, that certainty that he possesses the qualities she's been seeking, what's occurring is projection of her animus, her inner masculine. She's encountering her own unconscious masculine nature in external form. The strength, confidence, purpose, or protection she senses in him is actually her own undeveloped masculine capacity that she's placed outside herself. This is why falling in love feels so transcendent. You're not just meeting another person. You're encountering your own soul in projected form. You're touching parts of your psyche that have been unconscious, and the experience is legitimately numinous, genuinely spiritual. The problem isn't that projection creates powerful feelings. The problem is that projection makes real relationship impossible. Because here's what happens. The projected content doesn't actually belong to the other person. You've placed your own psychic material onto them, and inevitably, they fail to carry it. The woman you believed was the embodiment of feminine mystery and emotional depth turns out to be a real human with her own wounds, limitations, and neuroses. The man you were certain possessed masculine strength and protective power reveals himself to be equally vulnerable and uncertain. And when the projection collapses, and it always does, you feel betrayed, disappointed, disillusioned. But they didn't actually do anything wrong. They were never who you thought they were. You were in love with your projection, and when reality intruded, the fantasy couldn't sustain itself. Jung said it this way: everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is the gift hidden in projection collapse. Every time you're disappointed by a partner, every time you feel let down or betrayed, you're being shown your own unconscious material. The qualities you projected onto them, both the idealized perfections and the irritating flaws, these belong to your psyche, not theirs. Most people experience this projection collapse as relationship failure and immediately seek a new partner onto whom they can project again. They never recognize the pattern. They genuinely believe they keep choosing wrong, keep having bad luck, keep missing obvious red flags. But the truth is they're unconsciously seeking someone who can carry their projection, and when that person inevitably reveals their actual humanity, the disappointed seeker moves on to find the next projection screen. This cycle can continue for decades, a lifetime. Some people die having never recognized that they were falling in love with their own psyche over and over again, never actually meeting another human being, never experiencing real intimacy. But if you're reading this and resonating with what I'm describing, something different is happening to you. The projection mechanism itself is collapsing, not just the specific projections onto specific people, but the entire apparatus of romantic fantasy. Let me break down how this unfolds because it happens in stages. First, there's habitual projection. This is how you've always operated in romantic contexts. You meet someone, feel attraction, and immediately begin constructing an elaborate fantasy. You're not seeing them. You're seeing who you need them to be, who you imagine they might be, who your unconscious psychic content is using them to represent. This stage feels normal because it's what you've always done and what you see everyone around you doing. The falling in love sensation, the romantic intoxication, the certainty that this person is special, it's all projection, but you don't know that yet. Second comes pattern recognition. After enough relationship failures, after enough disappointing revelations, after enough moments of, why does this keep happening to me? You begin noticing something. The people you choose aren't as different as you thought. The ways relationships fail follow similar trajectories. The disappointments feel familiar. You start recognizing that maybe, possibly, you're repeating something, but you don't yet understand what it is. You might blame your attachment style, your childhood wounds, your self-esteem. These aren't wrong, but they're not the full picture. Third, you experience projection awareness. This is the breakthrough moment. You're mid-fantasy about someone you've just met, spinning elaborate futures and perfect scenarios, and suddenly you catch yourself. You realize, I don't actually know this person. I'm making this up. I'm projecting. This awareness is jarring because it reveals how much of what you've called love has been self-generated fiction. It's humbling and somewhat embarrassing. You've been so certain about people you barely knew. You've made life decisions based on projections. You've confused your internal psychic material with external reality. Fourth, you begin active withdrawal of projection. This is conscious work. When you meet someone new and feel that familiar romantic pull, you pause. You ask yourself, what am I projecting? What do I imagine about this person that I couldn't possibly know? What part of my own psyche am I encountering through them? This practice is difficult because it means consciously interrupting the romantic intoxication that feels so good. It means choosing clarity over fantasy, reality over idealization. But gradually, you get better at it. You can feel the projection impulse and choose not to indulge it. Fifth, projection immunity develops. This isn't that you can never project. Projection is partly unconscious and automatic, but that you catch it quickly and release it easily. You meet someone attractive and interesting, and instead of spinning fantasies, you stay curious about who they actually are. You notice when your mind tries to fill in gaps with imagination, and you gently return to what's actually present. You find yourself genuinely interested in discovering the real person rather than confirming your projection. Sixth, and finally, you reach reality preference. This is the profound shift. You discover that you actually prefer seeing people clearly to maintaining romantic fantasy. The truth of who someone is becomes more interesting than the fantasy of who you wanted them to be. Their real complexity, their actual humanity, their genuine limitations and gifts, these become more attractive than the idealized projection. This stage feels like growing up emotionally, like becoming an adult in your approach to love. Sarah reached this stage over the course of 3 years. The turning point came after a particularly intense relationship that ended badly. She'd been completely certain about this man, saw him as exactly what she'd been seeking, felt the relationship was destined, ignored warning signs because they didn't fit her projection. When it ended, when his actual character became undeniable, she didn't just feel heartbroken, she felt foolish. She'd been so wrong, so deluded, so convinced by her own fantasy, that humiliation forced her into deep self-examination. She started therapy, began journaling about her relationship patterns, started noticing how much of her romantic life had been self-generated fantasy, and slowly, painfully, she developed the ability to withdraw projection. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough to fundamentally change how she related to potential partners. Now, sitting across from this attractive man at the coffee shop, she's experiencing the result of that work. She can see him, actually see him. And while there's no fireworks, no romantic intoxication, No fantasy future spinning out of control. There's something better. Possibility. The possibility of getting to know an actual person. The possibility of discovering compatibility based on reality rather than projection. The possibility of building something real rather than maintaining something imagined. Comment below if you've experienced this shift. If you remember a time when you would have been completely swept up in romantic fantasy and now you find yourself seeing more clearly, because this shift, while seemingly disappointing, is actually evidence of profound psychological growth. But let's be honest about what dies in this process, because it's genuinely a death and you need to grieve it. You lose the fantasy of the perfect partner, that idealized image you've carried since adolescence, the person who embodies everything you've been seeking, who matches your list perfectly, who fulfills all your needs. That fantasy dissolves. And it's painful because that fantasy has sustained you through difficult times. It's been your hope, your motivation, your promise that love will eventually save you. You lose the belief that someone will complete you. The Jerry Maguire, "you complete me" narrative collapses. You realize that no external person can fill your internal emptiness, heal your wounds, or make you whole. This is devastating if you've been organizing your entire life around finding that completing other. It means accepting responsibility for your own wholeness. You lose unconscious expectations, all those unspoken, unexamined assumptions about what a partner should provide, how a relationship should unfold, what love should feel like. They become visible and questionable. You realize that many of your expectations were inherited, conditioned, or based on fantasy rather than reality, and releasing them means entering relationships with much more uncertainty, much less script, much less guaranteed outcome. You lose the ability to cast others in your psychological drama. You've been unconsciously assigning roles to people: the savior, the villain, the wounded soul you'll rescue, the strong one who will protect you. These role assignments made the world feel manageable and gave your relationships narrative coherence. But they weren't real. They were psychological scripts you were imposing on actual humans. And when you stop doing this, relationships become more unpredictable, less controlled, more genuinely mutual. You lose the use of relationships to avoid self-work. This is perhaps the most confronting loss. Many people enter relationships to escape themselves, to avoid facing their wounds, their emptiness, their questions about meaning and purpose. The romantic intoxication of new love provides temporary relief from existential anxiety. But when projection collapses, when fantasy dies, you can't use relationships for escape anymore. You have to face yourself. You have to do your own work. The other person can witness and support, but they can't do it for you. These losses are real. They're painful. And if you're in the middle of this death of romantic fantasy, you might be wondering, is this what readiness for love looks like? Because it doesn't feel romantic. It feels sobering, clarifying, almost deflating. But here's what Jung understood. You cannot love what you cannot see. Projection makes real love impossible because you're relating to your own psychic content rather than to another person. The death of projection is actually the birth of the capacity for genuine intimacy. Think about it this way. If you're in love with your projection of someone, you're essentially in love with yourself. You're having a relationship with your own unconscious material that you've externalized. There's no real other in this dynamic. You're alone with your psyche, using another person's body and personality as a screen for your internal movie. Real love, psychological relationship in Jung's terms, requires that you see the other person as they actually are, not who you need them to be, not who you imagine they could become, not your projection of your own anima or animus, the actual person with their real strengths and limitations, their genuine gifts and wounds, their true character and contradictions. This kind of seeing only becomes possible after projection collapses, and it creates a completely different experience of attraction and connection. Instead of the intoxicating sensation of falling in love with your projection, there's a quieter, more sustainable feeling of appreciating who someone actually is. Instead of the dramatic intensity of unconscious projection and merging, there's the deeper satisfaction of being with someone you actually know. I need to be vulnerable here about my own experience because this teaching isn't theoretical. I spent years addicted to romantic projection. I would meet someone, feel that lightning bolt of attraction, and within hours I'd have constructed an entire fantasy life with them. I'd be convinced I'd met my soulmate, that this was different from all previous connections, that this person possessed the magical qualities I'd been seeking, and every single time the projection would collapse. I'd discover that the person I'd fallen in love with was my creation, not their reality, and I'd feel betrayed, disappointed, certain they'd misrepresented themselves or changed, but they hadn't. I just couldn't see them clearly because I was so intoxicated by my own projection. The turning point came after a particularly painful relationship ending. I'd been completely certain about this woman, saw her as my perfect match, believed we were destined to be together. When she ended it, citing incompatibilities I'd been blind to, I was devastated. But in the devastation, something finally broke. I could no longer maintain the illusion. I could no longer blame her or bad timing or circumstances. I had to face the uncomfortable truth. I'd been in love with my projection, not with her. That recognition forced me into a year of intentional solitude. I stopped dating entirely. I worked with a Jungian analyst on understanding my anima projections. I journaled extensively about my pattern of falling in love with fantasy rather than reality, and slowly, painfully, the projection mechanism itself began to dissolve. When I finally started dating again, it felt completely different. Less exciting, less dramatic, less intoxicating. I'd meet someone attractive, and instead of spinning fantasies, I'd notice myself wanting to do that and consciously stopping. I'd ask questions to discover who they actually were, rather than confirming my imagined version. I'd stay present with what was actually happening rather than leaping ahead to imagined futures. And you know what I discovered? The people I met became more interesting, not less. Their real complexity, their actual humanity, their genuine contradictions, these were more fascinating than any projection I could have created. Real people, it turns out, are infinitely more interesting than our fantasies of them. But there's a shadow side to this death of projection that we need to address honestly. It can make you cynical. When you first recognize how much of what you've called love was projection, you might swing too far in the other direction. You might become hyper-rational about relationships, analyzing everything, refusing to feel anything that could be projection, treating potential partners as though they're subjects in a psychological experiment. This defensive clarity isn't the goal. The goal is to hold both, to stay open to genuine connection while remaining aware of projection, to feel attraction without confusing it with knowledge, to appreciate someone without projecting your idealized images onto them, to stay curious and present while noticing when fantasy tries to replace reality. Jung called this withdrawing projections, and he understood it was one of the most difficult psychological tasks, because projection serves a function. It allows us to encounter our own unconscious material through external forms. It provides the intensity and numinosity that makes relationships feel meaningful. When we withdraw a projection, we risk losing that magical quality, that sense of destiny and significance. But what we gain is infinitely more valuable: the capacity for real intimacy with real people, the ability to love someone for who they actually are rather than who we need them to be, the freedom from the cycle of idealization and disappointment that characterizes projection-based relationships. Here's the mirror effect you need to understand. Every partner who has disappointed you was showing you a projection you needed to withdraw. Every person who changed or revealed their true colors was actually just being who they always were, while your projection dissolved. Every relationship that failed because of incompatibility was teaching you about your own unconscious material that you were trying to externalize. This doesn't mean you chose wrong or were stupid or should have known better. It means you were operating from the normal human mechanism of projection, and the failures were invitations to become conscious. Each disappointment was your psyche saying, "Wake up, see clearly, stop confusing your inner world with external reality." And if you've been through enough of these cycles, if you've experienced enough projection collapses, if you've done enough work to understand the mechanism, then something shifts. The death of romantic fantasy becomes complete, not because you've become jaded or closed, but because you've become capable of something better, seeing people as they actually are and loving them for that, rather than for who you imagined they could be. This is the first clue that your soul is ready for higher love, because you cannot enter sacred relationship while trapped in projection. You cannot experience the Coniunctio, the sacred marriage, with someone you don't actually see. Psychological intimacy requires psychological clarity. Soul union requires that you're meeting another soul, not your projection of one. Sarah left that first date without the romantic intoxication she would have felt 2 years earlier, but with something better, clarity. She knew what had been genuinely enjoyable in the conversation and what had felt forced. She recognized authentic points of connection and real areas of incompatibility. She wasn't constructing a fantasy future, but she was open to discovering if something real might develop. A few weeks later, she met someone else. And again, there was no projection, no fantasy, no romantic intoxication, just clear seeing. And with this person, what she saw was more aligned with who she actually was, what she genuinely valued, how she wanted to live. The attraction wasn't based on him fulfilling some idealized image. It was based on recognizing compatibility with his actual personality, his real values, his genuine character. They've been together now for a year, and the relationship continues to operate from this foundation of clear seeing rather than projection. When difficulties arise, and they do, neither person feels betrayed because neither projected perfection onto the other. When growth edges appear, and they do, both can engage them because they're relating to the real person, not a fantasy that must be maintained. This is what becomes possible after the death of romantic fantasy. Real relationship with real people, built on truth rather than projection, sustained by clarity rather than illusion. But let me be clear about what this doesn't mean. It doesn't mean you'll never idealize anyone again, never feel intense attraction, never experience the magic of new connection. Projection is partly unconscious and automatic. You'll continue to project at times, but you'll catch it faster, withdraw it more easily, and preference reality over fantasy. It also doesn't mean relationships become purely rational or devoid of mystery. There's profound mystery in actually seeing another person, in discovering who they really are, in witnessing their complexity unfold over time. But it's the mystery of reality, not the mystery of your projection. And it doesn't mean you become impossible to please or endlessly critical. Real people, when you actually see them, are both more limited and more beautiful than your projections. They can't fulfill the impossible fantasies you might have projected, but they offer something your projections never could. Genuine presence, real connection, actual humanity. If you're experiencing this death of romantic fantasy and projection, if you notice that you can see people more clearly now, if the intoxication of new attraction has transformed into something calmer and more grounded, This isn't a problem, this is preparation. Your psyche is becoming capable of psychological relationship rather than participation mystique. You're developing the capacity to love people as they actually are rather than as you need them to be. And that capacity is rare. Most people never develop it. They spend their lives projecting and being disappointed, seeking the perfect partner who can carry their projections, blaming others for not living up to imagined standards. But you're different now. You've died to that way of relating, and in that death, something new has been born. The ability to see, and in seeing, to truly love. This is the first clue, the foundation. Because everything else we're going to explore, the shadow work, the animus integration, the pattern recognition, all of it builds on this basic capacity, seeing clearly, withdrawing projection, preferencing reality over fantasy. Welcome to the threshold. Your soul is preparing for higher love. And this death, painful as it is actually a birth. Let's continue. There's a particular kind of solitude that prepares the soul for higher love. And if you've experienced it, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's not loneliness. It's not avoidance of intimacy. It's not fear of relationship disguised as spiritual practice. It's something else entirely. A conscious, intentional period of being profoundly alone with yourself. Not because you're running from connection, but because you're running toward wholeness. And the second clue that your soul is ready for higher love is that this period has naturally, organically completed itself. Let me introduce you to James. He's 38, sitting in his apartment on a Friday evening, content with his own company in a way that would have been impossible for his younger self. 3 years ago, after his last serious relationship ended badly, he made a decision that confused everyone around him. He chose to be single, not temporarily while he healed or casually while he played the field, but genuinely, intentionally single. He deleted the dating apps. He stopped going to bars looking for connection. He turned down setups from well-meaning friends. He devoted himself to something that terrified him. His own company. The first 6 months were brutal. He confronted the void he'd been filling with relationships. He faced the questions he'd been avoiding by focusing on partnership problems. He discovered how much of his identity had been constructed around being someone's boyfriend, and how little he knew about who he was without that role. He felt the full weight of his wounds, his fears, his unprocessed grief. He wanted to run back to relationship, to find someone new to distract him from himself. But he didn't. He stayed. And somewhere around month 7, something shifted. The desperate need for partnership began to dissolve. The aching loneliness transformed into something else. Not contentment with isolation, but genuine enjoyment of his own presence. He started discovering who he was beyond relationship dynamics. He developed interests that weren't about impressing potential partners. He learned to self-soothe, to celebrate himself, to be his own primary companion. By year 2, he'd become someone different, more whole, less needy, comfortable in his own skin in a way he'd never been. And strangest of all, he wasn't lonely anymore, not because he didn't value connection, but because he'd developed such a rich relationship with himself that partnership became a desire rather than a need. Now, 3 years in, James notices something profound. The solitude has completed its teaching. He's not fleeing himself anymore. He's not using being single as protection from intimacy. He's genuinely ready to share what he's cultivated, not because he needs someone to complete him, but because he's become so full that he naturally wants to overflow into partnership with another whole being. This is the second clue, and Jung understood why it matters so fundamentally. He taught that individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated self, often requires a period of withdrawal from relationships, not forever, but for as long as it takes to do the internal work, without the distraction of managing another person's projections, needs, and psychological material. Most people move from relationship to relationship without pause. They end one partnership and immediately seek another. They can't tolerate being alone because they've never developed a relationship with themselves. They need external validation, emotional regulation from others, identity confirmation from partnership. This pattern can continue for a lifetime, serial monogamy or serial dating, but never the pause necessary for internal development. But if you're experiencing this second clue, you've broken that pattern. You've spent significant time, months or years, in intentional solitude. And crucially, this wasn't avoidance. You weren't hiding from intimacy or protecting yourself from hurt. You were actively choosing yourself. You were making your own internal development the priority. You were becoming your own primary relationship. Let me break down what Jung called the solitude integration journey, because it unfolds in distinct stages. First comes the relationship exit. Something ends. A partnership concludes. A marriage dissolves. A dating pattern finally breaks. This exit might be chosen or forced, clean or messy, but it creates the space, the sudden absence of relationship as the organizing principle of your life. And in that absence, you face a choice. Fill it immediately with someone new or stay with what emerges in the emptiness. Second comes the grief period. Even if the relationship was problematic, even if you chose to leave, even if you know it was right, there's grief. Grief for what was, grief for what you hoped it would become, grief for the fantasy of partnership itself. This grief is necessary. It's the emotional processing that allows completion. Many people skip this stage, rushing into new connections to avoid the pain. But if you stayed with it, if you let yourself fully grieve, you created space for something new to emerge. Third comes the discovery phase. Who am I alone? This is the terrifying and liberating question that arises when you're no longer defining yourself through relationship. You start discovering preferences you'd never voiced because you were always accommodating a partner. You explore interests you'd neglected because you were focused on maintaining connection. You reclaim parts of yourself that had been suppressed or hidden. This phase feels simultaneously like coming home and meeting a stranger. You're discovering who you actually are beneath all the relational roles you've played. Fourth comes the deep work. This is where solitude becomes transformative rather than just restorative. You can't avoid your shadow when you're alone with yourself. You can't project your wounds onto a partner who isn't there. You can't use relationship drama to distract from existential questions, so you're forced into the work. Therapy, shadow integration, pattern recognition, wound healing. You confront the internal structures that were sabotaging your relationships. You examine your complexes, your defenses, your unconscious strategies. This work is grueling, but it's only possible in solitude because it requires complete honesty with yourself without the complications of managing another person's needs. Fifth comes self-partnership. This is the profound shift where you stop waiting for someone else to meet your needs and learn to meet them yourself. You become your own source of validation, emotional regulation, celebration, and support. You learn to self-soothe when anxious, to encourage yourself when scared, to celebrate your victories without external acknowledgement. You develop what Jung called ego strength, a stable sense of self that doesn't require constant external confirmation. This doesn't mean you become self-sufficient in all ways or don't value support from others. It means you're no longer dependent on external sources for your basic psychological needs. Sixth comes completion recognition. This is subtle and hard to force. You can't decide that solitude has completed its teaching. You can only recognize when it has. The sign is that you stop using being single as identity or protection. You're not afraid of partnership anymore, but you're also not desperate for it. You feel genuinely complete as you are, and from that completeness, you're naturally open to sharing yourself with another whole being. There's no urgency, no timeline, no sense that something's missing, just a quiet readiness. Seventh and finally comes natural opening. You don't decide to start looking for partnership. You simply notice that you're open to it in a way you weren't before, not from need or loneliness or social pressure, but from genuine desire to share the richness of life you've cultivated. You might re-engage with dating, but it feels completely different now. You're not seeking completion or validation or distraction. You're exploring whether there's someone whose company you'd actually prefer to your own, which is a much higher standard than most people ever apply. James moved through all 7 stages over 3 years. The first year was dominated by grief, discovery, and the terror of being alone with himself. The second year was deep work, therapy, shadow integration, confronting the patterns that had sabotaged his previous relationships. The third year was consolidation, self-partnership becoming natural, completion recognition dawning gradually, and finally, the natural opening that brought him to where he is now. And sitting in his apartment this Friday evening, he realizes something that would have seemed impossible 3 years ago. He's genuinely happy alone, not settling for solitude while secretly hoping for rescue, but authentically content with his own company. And from that contentment, a new desire has emerged, not to escape himself through partnership, but to share himself with someone who's done similar work. Comment below if you've experienced this, if you remember the desperate need for partnership and can contrast it with where you are now, genuinely complete alone, open to connection but not needing it, because this shift is evidence of profound psychological maturation. But let's be specific about what solitude teaches, because these lessons are the prerequisites for higher love. First, solitude teaches that your own company is enough. You discover that you can be with yourself, with your thoughts, your feelings, your presence, without needing external distraction or validation. This seems simple, but most people literally cannot do it. They need television, social media, constant activity, or other people to avoid being alone with themselves. But you've learned to be present with yourself, and in that presence, you've discovered that you're actually good company. Second, solitude teaches that you can meet your own needs. You learn to comfort yourself when sad, encourage yourself when afraid, celebrate yourself when successful. You discover internal resources you didn't know you had. You develop the capacity to self-regulate emotionally rather than depending on others to manage your states. This doesn't mean you never need support or never want companionship. It means you're not dependent on external sources for basic psychological functioning. Third, solitude teaches that wholeness isn't found in another person. The completion fantasy that someone out there has what you're missing and will make you whole dies in extended solitude. You discover that you have to complete yourself. No external person can give you what you haven't cultivated internally. This is simultaneously devastating and liberating. Devastating because you have to abandon the rescue fantasy. Liberating because you're no longer waiting for someone else to give you permission to be whole. Fourth, solitude teaches that your wounds are your responsibility. When you're in relationship, it's easy to make your partner responsible for triggering your wounds, healing them, or avoiding them. But alone, you can't do that anymore. Your wounds are yours. Your triggers are information about your unhealed material. Your patterns are your responsibility to recognize and transform. This radical self-responsibility is uncomfortable, but it's the only path to psychological maturity. Fifth, solitude teaches that you contain both masculine and feminine energies. Men discover they have an inner feminine, emotional depth, intuition, receptivity, creativity, Women discover they have an inner masculine, purpose, strength, protective boundaries, penetrating clarity. In relationship, it's easy to split these energies, projecting your inner opposite onto your partner and depending on them to carry it. But solitude forces you to develop both within yourself, making you more complete and less dependent on external opposites for balance. Sixth, solitude teaches that you can self-soothe and self-celebrate. You learn to be with difficult emotions without needing someone to rescue you. You learn to acknowledge your achievements without needing external validation. You become your own witness, your own support system, your own source of encouragement. Again, this doesn't mean you never want support from others. It means you're capable of providing it for yourself when others aren't available. These lessons are what make higher love possible, because Jung understood that psychological relationship, conscious union between two individuated beings, requires that both people have completed this work. If you haven't learned to be with yourself, you'll use partnership to avoid yourself. If you haven't met your own needs, you'll drain your partner trying to get them to fill you. If you haven't taken responsibility for your wounds, you'll make your partner responsible for managing them. But if you've spent this time in solitude, if you've done the work, learned the lessons, become your own primary partner, then you bring something completely different to relationship. Wholeness, not perfection, not invulnerability, but fundamental completeness. And two whole people can create something two incomplete people never can. Genuine partnership, rather than codependent merger. I need to share my own experience with this because it's what taught me the value of solitude. After a particularly painful relationship ended when I was 33, I did something I'd never done before. I stayed single. Not for a few weeks or months while I healed enough to date again, but genuinely single for 2 full years. The first 6 months were terrifying. I'd been in relationships almost continuously since age 18. I'd moved from partner to partner, barely pausing between connections. Being single wasn't just unusual for me, it was identity-threatening. I didn't know who I was without someone to relate to, without relationship drama to focus on, without partnership to define me. I felt the full force of my wounds, without anyone to project them onto. I recognized patterns I'd been repeating for 15 years because I could finally see them clearly without the distraction of managing current relationship dynamics. I confronted my shadow, my neediness, my manipulation tactics, my tendency to lose myself in partnership. It was brutal. But around month 8, something remarkable happened. I woke up one Saturday morning and realized I was looking forward to the day, not despite being alone, but because I was alone. I'd started enjoying my own company. I'd developed a rich internal life. I'd cultivated interests and practices that were genuinely mine rather than performed for potential partners. By year 2, I'd become someone different, still wounded in some ways, still growing, but fundamentally more whole. I'd learned to meet my own emotional needs. I'd developed relationships with my inner masculine and feminine. I'd taken complete responsibility for my patterns and wounds. I'd become my own primary partner. And when those 2 years ended, not because I decided they should, but because I genuinely felt complete, my approach to relationship had transformed entirely. I wasn't looking to date because I was lonely or needed validation or wanted to avoid myself. I was genuinely curious about whether there was someone whose company I'd prefer to my own, which is a radically higher standard. This is the test of completed solitude. Do you actually prefer being alone to being with someone incompatible? Most people don't. They'll accept poor partnership over being single because they can't tolerate their own company. But if solitude has completed its teaching, you've developed such a rich relationship with yourself that you'd rather be alone than compromise that quality. Here's the mirror effect. The quality of person you attract directly reflects your comfort with solitude. When you're desperate for partnership, you attract people equally desperate. When you're using relationship to avoid yourself, you attract people doing the same. But when you're genuinely complete alone and choosing partnership from overflow rather than need, you attract others who've done the same work. This doesn't mean attracts in a simplistic way. It means that your level of internal development determines what kind of relationship you're capable of sustaining. If you haven't individuated, if you haven't spent the time in solitude learning to be whole, you'll create relationships based on participation mystique, codependent merger, mutual projection. But if you have individuated, if solitude has completed its teaching, you become capable of psychological relationship, conscious partnership between two whole beings. But I want to address a common misunderstanding. This isn't about becoming so comfortable alone that you don't want partnership. That's actually avoidance disguised as wholeness. True completion of solitude feels like genuine readiness. You're not afraid of intimacy, not protecting yourself from vulnerability, not hiding behind "I'm whole on my own" as defense against connection. The sign is that you want partnership without needing it. You desire connection, but you're not desperate for it. You're open to love, but not looking to be saved by it. You'd enjoy sharing life with another person, but you're not waiting for life to begin until that person appears. James experienced this distinction clearly. For the first year of his solitude, he was genuinely not ready for relationship. He was still healing, still discovering himself, still too raw and uncertain. For the second year, he was deep in the work, and partnership would have been a distraction from necessary internal development. But by the third year, something shifted. He wasn't hiding anymore. He wasn't using being single as protection. He was genuinely complete and genuinely ready, and that readiness didn't come from deciding it was time to date again. It emerged organically from his own internal development. He noticed he was thinking about partnership differently, not as rescue or completion, but as potential enrichment of an already full life. He noticed he was open to meeting people without agenda or desperation. He noticed he could imagine sharing his life while maintaining his autonomous self. This organic readiness is the sign. You can't force it. You can't decide that solitude has taught you enough, and now you're ready. The readiness emerges from the work, from the integration, from the genuine completion of what needed to happen in that protected time alone. And here's what makes this clue so significant. Most people never experience this. They never give solitude enough time to complete its teaching. They're so uncomfortable being alone that they rush back into relationship before the work is done, and then they recreate the same patterns, attract the same type of person, experience the same disappointments, because they're still operating from the same internal structures that created those patterns in the first place. But you've been different. You've stayed with the solitude even when it was uncomfortable. You've done the work even when it was painful. You've chosen yourself even when external voices were telling you to settle down, find someone, stop being so picky, lower your standards. And in that choosing of yourself, you've prepared your soul for something most people never experience. Partnership as choice rather than need. Connection as overflow rather than rescue. Relationship as mutual enrichment rather than codependent survival. Jung said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." Solitude teaches you to communicate with yourself, to know what's important, to honor your truth, to be present with your experience. And when you can do that with yourself, you become capable of doing it with another person. You become capable of genuine intimacy rather than desperate clinging. If you're in this place now, if solitude has completed its teaching, if you're genuinely ready to share your wholeness rather than seeking completion, you're standing at a rare threshold. You've done work most people avoid their entire lives. You've become someone capable of higher love. And the beautiful paradox is that you're ready for partnership precisely because you don't need it. You're prepared for sacred union because you've achieved internal union. You're capable of loving another because you've learned to love yourself. Not in a narcissistic way, but in the way of being good company to yourself, being your own primary relationship, being at home in your own presence. This is the second clue. The foundation has been laid. The container has been built. Your soul has been preparing in solitude for the union that awaits. Let's continue to discover what else you've become capable of. If there's a single factor that determines whether you're capable of higher love, it's this. Have you met your shadow? Not acknowledged that you have flaws, not admitted that you're not perfect, but actually encountered the rejected, repressed, and denied aspects of your psyche, the darkness you've spent your life trying to hide, the qualities you've insisted aren't you, the capacities for cruelty and selfishness and manipulation that you've projected onto others while maintaining your own innocence. Because the third clue that your soul is ready for sacred union is that you've done this brutal work, you've faced your shadow, and you've integrated it. Let me tell you about Rachel and David. They met at 40, both having been through multiple relationships, both having spent years in therapy. On their third date, something unusual happened. Rachel was sharing a story about her previous marriage, and she said something that surprised even herself. I blamed him for being controlling, but the truth is I was using passive aggression to manipulate every situation while pretending to be the flexible one. I was just as controlling as he was, but I hid it better. Most people wouldn't reveal this level of self-knowledge on a third date. Most people would present their best self, maintain the illusion of being the good one in previous relationships, cast themselves as the victim of others' failures. But Rachel had done something different. She'd integrated her shadow. She knew her capacity for manipulation. She'd stopped denying it or projecting it onto others. She could acknowledge it without being destroyed by shame. David felt something shift in him when she said this. Not repulsion or judgment, but recognition and relief. Because he'd done similar work. He'd faced his own capacity for cruelty, his tendency toward emotional withdrawal as a weapon, his hidden resentments that he'd disguised as reasonable boundaries. He said, I've been the cold one in relationships, the one who withholds affection when I'm hurt. I've done it consciously, knowing it would wound my partner, telling myself I was just protecting myself. This moment between them wasn't about confession or seeking absolution. It was about something much deeper. Two people who'd integrated their shadows, recognizing each other. Two people who'd stopped splitting themselves into acceptable and unacceptable, light and dark, good and bad. Two people who'd become psychologically whole enough to acknowledge their full humanity. And over the following months, their relationship operated at a level of intimacy that neither had experienced before. When Rachel's shadow surfaced, her controlling tendencies, her passive aggression, David wasn't shocked or betrayed. He could witness it without making her wrong because he'd witnessed his own shadow. When David's darkness emerged, his cruelty, his withdrawal, Rachel could hold space for it without being destroyed because she'd held space for her own darkness. This is what Jung meant when he said, one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Shadow integration isn't about becoming more moral or better behaved. It's about becoming more whole, accepting that you contain both light and darkness, both creative and destructive impulses, both love and hate, both generosity and selfishness. And this wholeness is absolutely necessary for higher love, because unintegrated shadow makes psychological intimacy impossible. Here's why. If you haven't integrated your shadow, you will unconsciously act it out in relationships, while denying it's yours. You'll manipulate while insisting you're just helping. You'll be cruel while claiming you're just being honest. You'll control while believing you're simply taking care of things. Your shadow operates, but you're unconscious of it, so you can't take responsibility for it or manage it consciously. Or you'll project your shadow onto your partner. You'll see in them the qualities you've disowned in yourself. You'll be intensely triggered by their selfishness because you've denied your own. You'll judge their cruelty harshly because you've refused to acknowledge your capacity for it. You'll create a split where they carry the darkness and you remain innocent, and this split makes real intimacy impossible because you're not actually seeing them. You're seeing your projection of your disowned shadow. Or you'll seek partners to carry your shadow for you. You'll be attracted to people who express the qualities you've repressed. The nice girl falls for the bad boy who acts out her repressed aggression. The overly responsible person seeks the chaotic partner who expresses their denied spontaneity. The emotionally controlled person chooses the volatile partner who carries their repressed feelings. These attractions feel compelling, even destined, but they're actually unconscious arrangements where each person carries what the other has disowned. And they always end in disappointment because no one can permanently carry someone else's shadow. But if you've integrated your shadow, if you've done the brutal work of facing, acknowledging, and accepting your darkness, everything changes. You're no longer unconsciously acting out what you deny. You're no longer projecting your disowned material onto partners. You're no longer seeking someone to express what you've repressed. You become capable of genuine psychological intimacy because there's nothing left to hide, nothing off limits, nothing that must remain unconscious to maintain your self-image. Let me break down the shadow integration process because it unfolds in predictable stages. First comes shadow denial. This is where most people remain their entire lives. You genuinely believe you're not like that, not manipulative, not cruel, not selfish, not dishonest. You see these qualities in others and feel morally superior. You maintain a self-image of being good, kind, honest, selfless. This denial requires enormous psychic energy because you're constantly managing your behavior to confirm your self-image and constantly explaining away evidence that contradicts it. Any hint of your shadow must be immediately rejected, rationalized, or projected outward. Second comes projection recognition. You start noticing that you keep attracting the same type of person, controlling partners or unavailable ones or narcissistic ones. You keep seeing the same qualities in different people. And if you're paying attention, you start wondering, why do I keep encountering this? Why does this pattern follow me? The answer is projection. You're seeing your own disowned shadow in others. You're attracting people who carry what you've denied in yourself. Or you're projecting your shadow onto people who may not actually possess those qualities. This recognition is uncomfortable because it suggests the problem isn't out there, it's internal. Third comes shadow acknowledgement. This is the breakthrough, and it's excruciating. You have to admit, that's in me too. The manipulation you've judged in your ex, you do that. The cruelty you've condemned in your parent, you're capable of it. The selfishness you've criticized in your friend, you have it. This acknowledgement threatens your entire self-concept. It means you're not the good person you thought you were. It means you contain darkness. It means you're morally complex rather than simply righteous. Most people can't tolerate this and retreat back into denial. But if you stay with it, if you can acknowledge your shadow without fragmenting, you've crossed a threshold. Fourth comes exploration. You begin investigating your darkness with curiosity rather than shame. When did you manipulate someone? How did it feel? What need was it serving? When have you been cruel? What triggered it? What part of you enjoyed it? This exploration isn't about wallowing in guilt or confirming that you're a bad person. It's about understanding the full range of your humanity. You discover that your shadow has reasons, needs, intelligence. Your cruelty protected you when you felt vulnerable. Your manipulation tried to get needs met that you couldn't ask for directly. Your selfishness preserved necessary boundaries. Your shadow isn't just destructive. It's been trying to help you survive, albeit in unconscious and problematic ways. Fifth comes integration. This is where you accept your shadow as part of yourself, not something to be eliminated or transcended, but something to be consciously related to. You acknowledge, yes, I have capacity for cruelty, and I'm responsible for managing it rather than acting it out unconsciously. Yes, I can be manipulative and I can choose to communicate directly instead. Yes, I'm selfish at times and I can balance self-care with consideration for others. Integration doesn't mean expressing every shadow impulse. It means having conscious relationship with your darkness, so you're not possessed by what you deny. Sixth comes shadow wisdom. This is profound and surprising. You discover that your integrated shadow contains gifts. Your cruelty, when conscious and channeled, becomes the capacity to deliver difficult truths with clarity. Your manipulation, when owned and transformed, becomes strategic intelligence about social dynamics. Your selfishness, when integrated, becomes healthy self-protection and boundary setting. The shadow qualities that seemed purely negative reveal themselves as distorted versions of necessary capacities. When you bring them into consciousness, they become tools rather than unconscious saboteurs. Seventh and finally comes wholeness. You stop splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You hold the paradox of being both kind and cruel, both generous and selfish, both honest and capable of deception. You're no longer performing goodness or defending innocence. You're simply human, complex, contradictory, containing multitudes. And from this wholeness, you can enter relationship without needing your partner to be all good or all bad, without needing to split reality into heroes and villains, without needing to maintain illusions about anyone's perfection. Rachel spent 3 years moving through these stages. The catalyst was a therapist who confronted her passive aggression directly. Rachel had been complaining about her husband's controlling behavior when the therapist said, "You're controlling this entire dynamic right now, using your tears to manipulate me into agreeing with you, presenting yourself as helpless to avoid responsibility, making sure I see you as the victim." Rachel was furious. She almost left therapy, but something in her recognized the truth. Over the following months, she began acknowledging her manipulative patterns. She explored where they came from. A mother who taught her that direct assertion was aggressive and unladylike, that she should get her way through indirect influence. She saw how she'd been unconsciously using these tactics in every relationship, maintaining plausible deniability while orchestrating outcomes, and slowly, painfully, she integrated this shadow. She learned to ask directly for what she wanted, to assert her needs without manipulation, to take overt responsibility rather than operating covertly. David's journey was different but parallel. His shadow was the opposite, overt cruelty rather than covert manipulation. He'd learned from his father that emotional withdrawal was power, that the person who cares less wins, that vulnerability is weakness. So he'd developed a pattern of punishing partners through coldness when they displeased him, all while telling himself he was just needing space or protecting his boundaries. His shadow acknowledgement came during a particularly brutal relationship ending. His partner said, "You're not emotionally unavailable. You're emotionally withholding. You punish me with silence. You enjoy watching me beg for your attention. There's a cruelty in you that you pretend is just self-protection." He wanted to dismiss this as her projection, but he couldn't, because it was true. He did withhold strategically. He did use coldness as a weapon, and some part of him did derive satisfaction from the power it gave him. Facing this darkness in himself was devastating. His self-image as the reasonable one, the one who just needed healthy space, the one who was protecting himself from demanding women. All of it crumbled. He had to acknowledge, I'm cruel. I use emotional withdrawal to hurt people. I've been doing this unconsciously while believing I was just taking care of myself. But as he integrated this shadow, something unexpected happened. He discovered that underneath his cruelty was profound vulnerability, a terror of being controlled, a fear of losing himself in relationship, a deep wound around his autonomy being violated in childhood. His cruelty was a distorted attempt at self-protection. And when he could acknowledge it consciously, he could develop healthier ways of maintaining boundaries without weaponizing his withdrawal. When Rachel and David met, both had done this work. Both had integrated shadows. Both could acknowledge their darkness without being destroyed by shame. And this created a foundation for intimacy that neither had experienced before. Comment below if you've done this work, if you remember discovering your shadow, the shock and shame of it, and then the strange freedom of integration. Because this work is rare and it's what separates ego love from soul love. But let's be specific about the shadows that must be integrated for higher love. Because Jung identified particular ones that sabotage relationship when unacknowledged. First, your capacity for manipulation. Everyone manipulates. The question is whether you do it consciously or unconsciously. Unconscious manipulation is the most dangerous, using tears, withdrawal, anger, or victim status to control outcomes while maintaining plausible deniability. You genuinely believe you're not manipulating because you're not aware you're doing it. But your shadow is orchestrating everything. Integration means acknowledging, yes, I manipulate. Yes, I use strategies to get my way without direct asking, and from that acknowledgement choosing direct communication instead. Second, your selfishness. We're conditioned to believe that being selfish is the worst thing, so we deny our selfishness, project it onto others, and develop elaborate justifications for getting our needs met that make us look selfless. But everyone is selfish. The question is whether your selfishness is conscious and balanced or unconscious and totalizing. Integration means acknowledging, yes, I prioritize my needs. Yes, I take more than I give sometimes. Yes, I make choices that serve me even when they inconvenience others. And from that acknowledgement, consciously balancing self-care with consideration for others. Third, your cruelty. This is perhaps the hardest to acknowledge. We want to believe we're incapable of cruelty, but everyone has said things designed to wound, withheld things to punish, taken satisfaction in another's pain. Integration means facing, yes, I've been cruel. Yes, I've deliberately hurt people. Yes, some part of me enjoyed the power of it. And from that acknowledgement, taking responsibility and developing compassion for your own woundedness that generates cruelty. Fourth, your dishonesty, not just lying, but all the ways you present false versions of yourself to manage others' perceptions, the half-truths, the strategic omissions, the performances of emotions you don't feel, the hiding of emotions you do feel. Integration means acknowledging, yes, I'm dishonest. Yes, I present calculated versions of myself. Yes, I manipulate truth to serve my interests. And from that acknowledgement, choosing authenticity even when it's uncomfortable. Fifth, your sexuality. Whatever you've been taught to repress about your sexual nature, the fantasies, the desires, the impulses that don't fit acceptable self-image, whether it's aggression or submission, vanilla or kinky, hetero or queer, monogamous or non-monogamous, whatever you've hidden, denied, or been ashamed of. Integration means acknowledging your actual sexual nature rather than performing the sexuality you believe you should have. Sixth, your neediness, the desperate hunger for validation, attention, reassurance. the empty void you try to fill with others' approval, the way you construct entire false selves to be worthy of love. Integration means facing, yes, I'm deeply needy. Yes, I manipulate for approval. Yes, I'm terrified of abandonment. And from that acknowledgement, learning to meet your needs yourself rather than extracting them from others. Seventh, your rage, the anger you've been taught to suppress, especially if you're female. The fury at injustices, personal and collective. The resentment at unmet needs and violations of boundaries. The violent fantasies you've never admitted having. Integration means acknowledging, yes, I'm enraged. Yes, I have destructive impulses. Yes, I want to hurt those who've hurt me. And from that acknowledgement, finding healthy expression and channeling rage into boundary setting and necessary destruction of what needs to die. Eighth, your jealousy, the comparative anxiety, the envy of others' success or happiness, the possessiveness in relationships, the fear of being replaced. Integration means facing, yes, I'm jealous. Yes, I compare myself obsessively. Yes, I want to control my partner's attention. And from that acknowledgement, understanding jealousy as information about your insecurities rather than truth about external threats. Ninth, your power hunger, the desire to dominate, control, influence, the satisfaction you get from being right, winning arguments, having others defer to you, the ways you've used intelligence, attractiveness, or status to establish hierarchy. Integration means acknowledging, yes, I want power. Yes, I manipulate for control. Yes, I enjoy dominance. And from that acknowledgement, using power consciously and ethically, rather than denying you want it while unconsciously wielding it. These are universal shadows. Everyone has them. The question is whether you've integrated them or remain unconscious of them. And your romantic relationships reveal the answer immediately. If you haven't integrated your shadow, your relationships will be characterized by projection, blame, moral superiority, and unconscious acting out. If you have integrated your shadow, your relationships become spaces of radical honesty, mutual witnessing, and conscious choice. I need to be vulnerable about my own shadow work because it was the most difficult psychological process I've ever undergone. For years, I maintained an identity as the emotionally available, communicative, evolved man. I prided myself on not being like other guys, not emotionally closed, not afraid of intimacy, not commitment phobic. This identity felt good. It made me the hero of my relationship stories. But in my early 30s, a therapist confronted something I'd been denying. My covert narcissism. I was using my emotional availability as a performance to secure validation. I was weaponizing vulnerability, sharing just enough to appear evolved while maintaining control. I was using the language of psychology to dominate arguments and maintain moral high ground. I was extracting endless emotional labor from partners while presenting it as mutual exchange. I was cruel in subtle, deniable ways, using my insight to wound precisely where it would hurt most, then denying any malicious intent. Acknowledging this shadow was excruciating. My entire self-concept depended on being the good one, the aware one, the evolved one. Facing that I was manipulative, narcissistic, and cruel in covert ways destroyed that identity. I wanted to reject the feedback, find a different therapist, maintain my innocent self-image. But I stayed with it. I explored my covert tactics. I examined the satisfaction I derived from being the more aware partner, the one who understood psychology better, the one who could diagnose others' issues while remaining blind to his own. I faced the cruelty I'd enacted while maintaining plausible deniability, and slowly I integrated it. I stopped performing emotional availability and started actually being available. I stopped weaponizing vulnerability and started being genuinely vulnerable. I took responsibility for my manipulative patterns rather than defending them as enlightened communication. I acknowledged my capacity for cruelty and worked to manage it consciously. This integration changed everything. My relationships after shadow work were completely different. I could be genuinely intimate because I wasn't hiding anything. I could witness partners' darkness without judgment because I'd witnessed my own. I could take responsibility for my impact rather than defending my intentions. I became capable of psychological relationship because I'd stopped splitting myself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Here's the mirror effect that you need to understand. What you judge most harshly in partners is your unintegrated shadow. The person whose selfishness enrages you. You have unacknowledged selfishness. The person whose manipulation repulses you. You manipulate in ways you don't acknowledge. The person whose emotional unavailability frustrates you. You're unavailable in ways you've rationalized. Your intense judgment of others always points to disowned aspects of yourself. This is why shadow integration is essential for higher love, because psychological intimacy requires that you can hold your partner's full humanity, their light and their darkness, without judgment or shock. And you can only do that if you've held your own full humanity first. You can only witness another's shadow if you've integrated your own. Jung said, "The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality." This is exactly right. Shadow integration means giving up your claim to moral superiority, your righteousness, your innocence. It means acknowledging that you're capable of everything you've judged in others. And this acknowledgement is humbling, devastating, and absolutely necessary. Because here's what becomes possible after shadow integration. You can be fully known. You don't have to hide aspects of yourself to be loved. You don't have to perform goodness to deserve connection. You can show your full complexity, your light and your darkness, and trust that you can be seen completely and still chosen, and you can fully know another. You're not shocked by their darkness because you've integrated your own. You're not demanding they be all good or all bad. You can hold the paradox of them being both kind and cruel, both generous and selfish, both loving and hurtful. You can love their full humanity rather than your projection of their edited highlights. Rachel and David discovered this in their relationship. When Rachel's shadow surfaced, her manipulative patterns, her control tactics, David could witness it without making her the villain. He could see it as part of her full humanity, something she was working with consciously rather than acting out blindly. And this witnessing created safety for Rachel to continue integrating her shadow rather than hiding it. When David's shadow emerged, his cruelty, his withdrawal patterns, Rachel could hold space for it without being destroyed or leaving. She could see it as his unconscious protection mechanism, something he was learning to manage differently. And this holding created safety for David to continue his integration work rather than defending his shadow as justified. Their relationship became a container for mutual shadow witnessing. They used each other's triggers as information. When Rachel felt controlled, instead of blaming David, she investigated, what's getting triggered in me? Where's my shadow of wanting to be controlled so I don't have to take responsibility? When David felt smothered instead of withdrawing, he explored, what's being activated? Where's my shadow of wanting to merge but being terrified of losing myself? This is what Jung meant by the Coniunctio, the sacred marriage of opposites that must happen internally before it can manifest externally. You have to marry your light and shadow within yourself, accepting both, integrating both, becoming whole through embracing your full humanity. And when two people who've done this internal marriage meet each other, they can create external sacred union, a relationship where both people's full humanity can be present without threat. If you've done this work, if you've faced your shadow, integrated your darkness, given up your claim to innocence, You're ready for a level of intimacy most people never access. You're capable of being fully known and fully knowing another. You're prepared for psychological relationship rather than the projected fantasy and defended innocence that characterizes most partnerships. This is the third clue, and it's the one that separates those who are ready for higher love from those who are still operating from ego structures that require them to be good, right, and innocent. Your shadow has been integrated. Your darkness has been made conscious. You're whole in a way that makes sacred union possible. Let's discover what else you've become capable of. There's a mystery at the heart of attraction that most people never solve. Why do you keep being drawn to the same type of person? Why does the chemistry you feel with certain people seem so magnetic, so destined, yet the relationships never work? Why do men seek women who possess qualities they themselves lack? And why do women chase men who embody capacities they haven't developed? Jung discovered the answer, and it's simultaneously beautiful and confronting. You're not attracted to that external person. You're attracted to your own inner opposite that you've projected onto them. The fourth clue that your soul is ready for higher love is that you've done the difficult work of consciously engaging your internal opposite-sex archetype. Men have developed relationship with their inner feminine, the anima. Women have cultivated connection with their inner masculine, the animus. And this internal development fundamentally transforms what you seek in external partners, because you're no longer projecting your undeveloped opposite onto others, desperately trying to find externally what you haven't cultivated internally. Let me tell you about Marcus. He's 36, sitting in his therapist's office, frustrated about his relationship pattern. I keep falling for the same woman, he says. Not literally the same person, but the same type. She's always mysterious, emotionally deep, artistic, intuitive. She seems to possess this profound inner life that I'm drawn to like a moth to flame. And for the first few months, it's intoxicating. But then something always happens. Either she becomes too chaotic, too emotional, too intense for me to handle, or I realize she's not actually the mystical being I imagined. She's a real person with real problems. And I feel betrayed, disappointed, like she changed or deceived me. His therapist asks, what if she never changed? What if you were never seeing her at all, but seeing your own inner feminine projected onto her? This question cracks something open in Marcus. Over the following months, he begins doing something he's never done, developing relationship with his own anima, his inner feminine. Through dream work, active imagination, and creative practices, he starts discovering that the qualities he'd been seeking in women, emotional depth, intuition, creativity, receptivity, mystery, these weren't actually outside him. They were his own undeveloped feminine capacities that he'd projected onto external women because he'd never learned to access them within himself. He'd been raised in a household where masculinity meant rationality, logic, control, achievement. Emotions were weakness. Intuition was dismissed as illogical. Creativity was impractical. Receptivity was passive. So he'd developed his masculine side, became successful, analytical, goal-oriented, controlled, but completely neglected his inner feminine. And then he projected this rejected feminine onto women, falling in love with his own disowned psychic content, using relationships to experience vicariously what he wouldn't develop in himself. As Marcus began consciously cultivating his inner feminine, journaling his emotions, trusting his intuition, engaging in creative pursuits, learning receptivity and stillness, something profound shifted. His desperate attraction to mysterious, artistic women began to dissolve. He could appreciate these qualities without needing a woman to carry them for him. He could see actual women more clearly because he wasn't projecting his anima onto them, and his relationships changed entirely. He became attracted to women not because they possessed what he lacked, but because of genuine compatibility based on who both people actually were. This is Jung's teaching on the anima and animus, and it's one of the most important concepts for understanding relationship dynamics. Every psyche, Jung discovered, contains both masculine and feminine energies. Men have an inner feminine, anima. Women have an inner masculine, animus. These aren't about gender roles or biological sex. They're archetypal energies present in everyone regardless of identity. And the relationship you have with your internal opposite-sex archetype determines everything about your external relationships. When you're unconscious of your anima or animus, you project this energy onto others. Men project their inner feminine onto women, falling in love with their own feminine nature in external form. Women project their inner masculine onto men, seeking in partners the masculine qualities they haven't developed internally. This projection creates the magnetic attraction, the sense of destiny, the feeling of this person has what I've been seeking. But the projection eventually collapses because the external person can't permanently carry your internal opposite. They're a real human with their own complexity, not the vessel for your disowned feminine or masculine. And when the projection fails, you feel betrayed, disappointed, certain they changed or weren't who they presented themselves to be. But they were always themselves. You were just seeing your projection. The alternative, and this is what prepares you for higher love, is to consciously engage your inner opposite, to develop relationship with your anima or animus, to cultivate the qualities within yourself that you've been seeking externally. This work is difficult because it means challenging how you've been conditioned to understand yourself and developing capacities that feel foreign or threatening. Let me break down what this journey looks like for both men and women. For men, developing relationship with the anima, first comes unconscious projection. You're completely identified with masculine energy, rationality, control, goal orientation, emotional suppression. Your inner feminine is unconscious, so you project her onto women. You fall in love with women who seem mysterious, emotional, intuitive, creative, all the qualities you've rejected in yourself. This projection feels like romantic destiny. You're certain you found your soulmate, your muse, the woman who completes you, but you're actually encountering your own disowned feminine through her form. Second comes projection pattern recognition. After enough disappointing relationships with the same type of woman, you start noticing something. Why do I keep choosing mysterious, artistic women? Why does the relationship always follow the same pattern? Initial intoxication, followed by frustration with her emotional intensity or chaos. You begin suspecting there's something you're doing, some pattern you're repeating. Third comes internal discovery. Through therapy, dream work, or psychedelic experiences, you have a breakthrough. The qualities I seek in women are in me. I have emotions, intuition, creativity, receptivity, but I've denied these because I was taught they're not masculine. I've been trying to experience my own feminine nature vicariously through women rather than developing it within myself. This recognition is simultaneously humbling and liberating. Fourth comes conscious dialogue. You begin actively engaging your anima through practices like active imagination, dialoguing with your inner feminine in meditation or journaling, dream work, noticing feminine figures in dreams, and exploring what they represent, or creative expression, engaging arts that access your feminine side. This feels awkward at first, even silly, but gradually you develop an actual relationship with this inner feminine energy. Fifth comes integration practices. You begin cultivating feminine qualities consciously, emotional literacy, learning to feel and express emotions rather than suppress them, intuition, trusting gut feelings and non-rational knowing, creativity, engaging artistic practices without needing them to be productive, receptivity, learning to receive, to be still, to allow rather than always controlling. Vulnerability, opening yourself emotionally rather than maintaining defended strength. These practices develop your internal feminine, making you more complete. Sixth comes projection withdrawal. As you develop your anima internally, you stop projecting her onto women. You can appreciate feminine qualities in women without needing them to carry your disowned feminine. You see actual women more clearly. Your attraction patterns shift. You're no longer exclusively drawn to mysterious artistic types because you've developed those qualities yourself. You become attracted to women based on compatibility with who you actually are, not completion of what you're missing. Seventh comes internal marriage. This is the goal, the integration of masculine and feminine within yourself. You're no longer split into masculine me versus my anima out there. You contain both energies, can access both, move fluidly between them as situations require. You're internally androgynous, which paradoxically makes you more fully and authentically masculine, not the rigid, controlled masculinity of someone suppressing their feminine, but the integrated masculinity of someone who's married their inner opposite. For women developing relationship with the animus, first comes unconscious projection. You're completely identified with feminine energy as culturally defined, emotional, relational, intuitive, receptive. Your inner masculine is unconscious, so you project him onto men. You fall for men who seem strong, purposeful, protective, intellectually penetrating. All the qualities you haven't developed in yourself. This projection feels like finding the one, the man who can provide what you're missing, purpose, direction, protection, strength. But you're actually encountering your own disowned masculine through his form. Second comes projection pattern recognition. After enough relationships where you felt diminished, controlled, or disappointed by men who seemed strong but were actually dominating, you begin noticing your pattern. Why do I keep choosing powerful men? Why do I feel simultaneously attracted to and suffocated by their strength? You start suspecting you're seeking something in them that you need to develop in yourself. Third comes internal discovery. Through therapy or self-examination, you realize the masculine qualities I seek in men: strength, purpose, protection, penetrating intellect, healthy aggression. These are my own undeveloped animus. I've been trained to believe these qualities aren't feminine, so I've suppressed them and sought them externally in men. I've been trying to experience my own masculine power vicariously through partners rather than claiming it within myself. Fourth comes conscious dialogue. You begin actively engaging your animus through practices like active imagination, dialoguing with your inner masculine, dream work, exploring masculine figures in dreams, or strength-building activities, physical training, martial arts, competitive pursuits. You develop relationship with your inner masculine voice, the part of you that knows what you want, sets boundaries, pursues goals, protects yourself. Fifth comes integration practices. You cultivate masculine qualities consciously, healthy aggression, learning to assert yourself, compete, fight for what matters, autonomy, developing independence and self-sufficiency rather than emotional dependency, purpose, discovering your own mission and direction rather than supporting someone else's, penetrating intellect, developing analytical clarity and intellectual power, protective boundaries, learning to protect yourself rather than seeking protection from men. These practices develop your internal masculine, making you more complete. Sixth comes projection withdrawal. As you develop your animus internally, you stop projecting him onto men. You can appreciate masculine qualities in men without needing them to provide what you haven't cultivated. You see actual men more clearly. Your attraction patterns shift. You're no longer exclusively drawn to powerful dominant types because you've developed that power yourself. You become attracted to men based on compatibility with who you actually are, not completion of what you lack. Seventh comes internal marriage, integration of masculine and feminine within yourself. You're no longer split into feminine me versus my animus out there. You contain both energies, access both, move between them fluidly. You're internally androgynous, which paradoxically makes you more fully and authentically feminine, not the collapsed, powerless femininity of someone who's suppressed their masculine, but the integrated femininity of someone who's claimed their full power. Marcus's journey through these stages took 2 years of consistent work. The turning point came through dream work. He had a recurring dream of a woman with dark hair who would appear at thresholds, doorways, bridges, edges of forests. She never spoke, but her presence felt significant, numinous. His therapist suggested he dialogue with this dream figure through active imagination. In meditation, Marcus invited this feminine presence into conversation. He asked, "Who are you? What do you want from me?" And surprisingly, she answered, not in external voice, but in thoughts and images that arose in his mind. She told him she was the part of him he'd abandoned. The emotional, intuitive, creative aspects he'd learned were unmasculine. She'd been trying to get his attention through his compulsive pursuit of external women who embodied these qualities. She wasn't separate from him. She was him, the disowned feminine he needed to reclaim. Over the following months, Marcus developed this relationship. He started journaling emotions rather than suppressing them. He took up painting, something he'd loved as a child, but abandoned as impractical. He learned to trust his intuition, those gut feelings he'd always dismissed as illogical. He practiced receptivity, allowing experiences rather than constantly controlling outcomes. And as he did this work, something profound happened to his romantic life. He went on a date with a woman who, in the past, he would have found boring. She wasn't mysterious or artistic in the dramatic way he usually sought. She was grounded, clear, emotionally intelligent, but not chaotic. And instead of feeling disappointed by the lack of mystique, Marcus found himself genuinely interested in her actual personality. He wasn't trying to extract emotional depth from her to vicariously experience his own. He had developed his emotional depth so he could appreciate hers without needing her to carry his anima. Comment below if you recognize this pattern in yourself. If you can trace the type of person you've been attracted to and see now that you are seeking your own undeveloped opposite, because this recognition is the beginning of the work that prepares you for higher love. For women, let me tell you about Sophia. She's 33 and she's always been attracted to powerful men, successful, dominant, intellectually intimidating. She'd tell herself she just appreciated intelligence and ambition, but her relationships followed a pattern. Initial admiration of his power, gradual feeling of being diminished in his shadow, eventual resentment that he took up all the space, and then either explosive ending or slow erosion into passivity. Her breakthrough came when a female mentor asked her, "What would happen if you developed your own power instead of seeking it in men?" The question felt threatening. Sophia had been raised with messages that female power was aggressive, unfeminine, threatening to men. She'd learned to support others' ambitions rather than pursue her own, to be relationally focused rather than goal-driven, to soften herself rather than sharpen her intellect. But she began exploring her animus, her inner masculine. She started a business she'd been dreaming about but thought was too ambitious. She took up Brazilian jiu-jitsu, learning physical aggression and competitive spirit. She stopped softening her intellectual insights to make men comfortable. She set fierce boundaries instead of accommodating everyone. She developed a clear sense of purpose and direction for her life, independent of relationship, and her attraction patterns transformed completely. She stopped being drawn to dominating men because she'd developed her own power. When she met men now, she wasn't assessing whether they could provide strength, protection, and purpose. She had those herself. She was assessing genuine compatibility, and she found herself attracted to a completely different type. Men who were secure enough in themselves that they didn't need to dominate, who could appreciate her power rather than feel threatened by it, who wanted partnership between equals rather than traditional masculine-feminine hierarchy. This internal development of your opposite sex archetype is crucial for higher love because of what it eliminates and what it creates. It eliminates unconscious projection. You stop falling in love with your own disowned psychic content, externalized through another person. You can see actual people rather than your projections. This might make initial attraction less intense, less magical, but it creates the foundation for real relationship. It eliminates completion seeking. You stop needing a partner to carry your undeveloped opposite. Men stop seeking women to provide emotional life, intuition, and creativity. Women stop seeking men to provide purpose, protection, and power. You become internally complete, which means you're choosing partnership from wholeness rather than need. It eliminates role rigidity. When you've integrated your inner opposite, you're not locked into performing one-dimensional masculinity or femininity. You can access both energies as needed. Men can be strong and vulnerable, rational and intuitive, goal-driven and receptive. Women can be nurturing and fierce, emotional and intellectually penetrating, soft and powerfully boundaried. This flexibility makes you more fully human and more capable of genuine partnership. It eliminates the split that creates types. You stop being attracted to the same type over and over because you're not seeking the same projected quality. Your attraction becomes more diverse, more based on actual compatibility than unconscious completion seeking. It creates capacity for seeing your partner clearly. When you're not projecting your anima or animus onto them, you can see who they actually are, their real strengths and limitations, their genuine character, their true complexity. This clear seeing is the foundation of psychological intimacy. It creates balance within yourself. You're not split into rigid masculine or feminine. You contain both. You're internally androgynous, which creates psychological flexibility and resilience. You can respond to situations with whatever energy they require rather than being locked into one mode. It creates attraction based on wholeness, meeting wholeness. When two people who've integrated their inner opposites meet, they're not seeking completion. They're choosing conscious union. They're attracted not because the other has what they lack, but because of genuine resonance, shared values, compatible life visions, mutual respect. I need to share my own experience with this because anima work transformed my entire approach to relationships. In my 20s, I had a very specific type, artistic women, usually with dark hair, who seemed to embody mystery, emotional depth, and creative brilliance. I would fall intensely for these women, certain each was my soulmate. The relationships were dramatic, intense, and ultimately disappointing because I was projecting my undeveloped anima onto them. After another painful ending of this pattern, I started working with a Jungian analyst who introduced me to anima work. Initially, I was resistant. It felt abstract, impractical, but I began practicing active imagination, dialoguing with my inner feminine in journal entries, and feminine figures started appearing in my dreams, sometimes threatening, sometimes alluring, sometimes wise and guiding. I began developing the qualities I'd been projecting onto women. I started writing fiction, accessing the creative and intuitive side I'd suppressed. I learned to feel and express emotions rather than intellectualizing them. I practiced receptivity, meditation, allowing, being rather than constantly doing. I developed relationship with my inner feminine as a real part of myself rather than something I needed to find externally. And my attraction patterns changed completely. I stopped being exclusively drawn to mysterious artistic women I started appreciating women across a much wider range of types because I wasn't seeking one projected quality. And when I met my current partner, the dynamic was entirely different. I wasn't trying to extract emotional depth or creativity from her. I had developed those myself. I was attracted to her actual personality, her real values, her genuine character. The relationship operates between two whole people rather than two halves seeking completion. Here's the mirror effect you need to understand. The external partners you attract reflect your relationship with your internal opposite. If a man hasn't developed his anima, he attracts women who are chaotic, emotionally overwhelming, or constantly needing to be rescued, reflecting his disowned and unintegrated feminine. If a woman hasn't developed her animus, she attracts dominating men, passive men she has to mother, or unavailable men who can't commit, reflecting her undeveloped and unintegrated masculine. But when you consciously develop your inner opposite, you attract partners who've done the same work. You find yourself meeting people who are internally balanced, who aren't projecting their disowned opposite onto you, who can see you clearly rather than as a screen for their projections. Jung said, "The anima and animus are the most important archetypal figures because they are the personification of the soul." This is why this work is essential for sacred relationship. Your anima or animus is the bridge to your own soul, to your unconscious, to the depths of your psyche. And when you develop conscious relationship with this inner opposite, you become ensouled, more fully yourself, more psychologically complete, more capable of genuine intimacy. The practical work of engaging your anima or animus includes active imagination. Set aside time for meditation or journaling, where you invite your inner opposite into dialogue. If you're male, invite your anima, your inner feminine, to speak. Ask her questions. What do you need from me? What am I denying? What am I seeking in external women that I should develop in myself? Listen to what arises, images, words, feelings, insights. This isn't fantasy or wishful thinking. It's accessing unconscious material through symbolic dialogue. Dream work. Pay attention to opposite-sex figures in your dreams. Men, notice the women who appear. Are they threatening or helpful, mysterious or clear, young or old? These represent different aspects of your anima. Women, notice the men who appear. Are they powerful or weak, protective or dangerous, known or unknown? These represent facets of your animus. Work with a therapist or journal about what these dream figures might be communicating about your relationship with your inner opposite. Embodied practices. Develop the qualities of your opposite through action. Men, engage in practices that develop your feminine. Creative arts, emotional expression, intuitive practices like tarot or I Ching, receptive activities like yoga or meditation, relational depth in friendships. Women, engage in practices that develop your masculine, physical strength training, competitive pursuits, goal-oriented projects, intellectual rigor, boundary setting practices, leadership roles. Notice your projections. When you feel intense attraction, pause and ask, what quality am I seeing in this person that I haven't developed in myself? Men, if you're attracted to her mystery, emotional depth, or creativity, are these your undeveloped anima qualities? Women, if you're attracted to his power, purpose, or protective strength, are these your undeveloped animus capacities? Use attraction as information about what you need to cultivate internally. Challenge gender conditioning. Examine the messages you received about what's appropriate for your gender. Men, what were you taught about emotions, intuition, creativity, receptivity, vulnerability? What did you learn to suppress as unmasculine? Women, what were you taught about power, aggression, ambition, intellectual assertion, self-protection? What did you learn to suppress as unfeminine? Consciously develop what was forbidden. Integrate rather than perform. The goal isn't to become more feminine as a man or more masculine as a woman in performance. It's to integrate these energies internally so you're psychologically complete. An integrated man is more authentically masculine because he's not suppressing his feminine to prove his masculinity. An integrated woman is more authentically feminine because she's not collapsing her masculine to appear appropriately female. Marcus and Sophia both completed this work, and when they eventually met each other at a mutual friends gathering, something unusual happened. There was attraction, but it wasn't the desperate magnetic pull that characterized their previous patterns. It was calmer, more grounded. They were both complete within themselves, so they weren't seeking completion from each other. Their conversation was between two whole people rather than two halves unconsciously seeking merger. Over the following months, as their relationship developed, they discovered they could hold genuine psychological intimacy because neither was projecting their inner opposite onto the other. When Marcus felt emotions or intuitive insights, he didn't need Sophia to carry his anima. He could access his own feminine. When Sophia had ambitions or needed to set fierce boundaries, she didn't need Marcus to provide masculine power. She had developed her own animus. Their relationship became what Jung called psychological relationship, conscious partnership between two individuated beings who've married their inner opposites and can therefore meet each other without projection, without completion seeking, without unconscious role assignments. This is the sacred marriage, the coniunctio that can only occur externally after it's occurred internally. If you've done this work, if you've consciously engaged your anima or animus, developed relationship with your inner opposite, integrated the qualities you used to seek in partners, you're ready for higher love. You're no longer seeking someone to complete you. You're no longer projecting your disowned psychic content onto others. You're internally balanced in a way that makes genuine partnership possible. This is the fourth clue, and it's what transforms you from someone seeking their other half to someone who's already whole, choosing to share that wholeness with another whole being. The foundation continues to build. Let's discover what else you've become capable of. There's a particular kind of psychological prison that most people live in without recognizing the bars. You keep choosing the same type of partner, experiencing the same relationship dynamics, having the same conflicts, and ending things for the same reasons, over and over again, with different faces but identical patterns. And you genuinely believe it's bad luck, wrong choices, or that you keep meeting the wrong people. But Jung understood something more confronting. These repetitions aren't accidental. They're your unconscious complexes engineering your relationships, giving you endless opportunities to heal what wasn't healed in childhood, to resolve what remains unresolved in your psyche. The fifth clue that your soul is ready for higher love is that you've broken free from this prison. You've recognized your relationship patterns with brutal clarity, traced them to their origins, understood the psychological complexes driving them, and consciously released these unconscious templates through deep integration work. You're no longer being driven by repetition compulsion. You're choosing consciously rather than being unconsciously chosen by your wounds. Let me tell you about Jennifer. She's 41, sitting in her therapist's office, having what she'll later describe as the most humiliating and liberating moment of her life. She's just ended another relationship, her fourth serious partnership that followed exactly the same pattern. She meets a charming man who initially seems emotionally available and devoted. The first few months are intoxicating. Then gradually he begins withdrawing, becoming less communicative, more distant, harder to pin down. Jennifer becomes increasingly anxious, trying harder to maintain connection. The more she pursues, the more he withdraws. Eventually, he either leaves or she ends it in exhaustion, feeling abandoned and questioning her worth. Her therapist asks a question that cracks everything open. Tell me about your relationship with your father. Jennifer's immediate response is defensive. This isn't about my father. This is about these men who present one way and then pull away. They're emotionally unavailable, but her therapist persists gently. Your father was an alcoholic, yes? Sometimes warm and present, sometimes distant and unreachable, and you spent your childhood trying to maintain connection with him, working harder when he withdrew, feeling like it was your responsibility to keep him engaged. Jennifer feels something collapse inside her, because it's exactly the same pattern. She's been unconsciously recreating her relationship with her alcoholic father in every romantic partnership, choosing men who have that same quality of intermittent availability, unconsciously trying to resolve her childhood wound by finally getting an unavailable man to stay, to choose her, to prove she's worthy of consistent love. And it never works because she's not actually in relationship with these men. She's in relationship with her father complex, using adult partnerships to reenact childhood dynamics. This recognition devastates her. 4 major relationships, countless dates, years of her life, all unconsciously driven by a psychological complex formed when she was 7 years old, watching her father choose alcohol over her presence. She thought she'd been making conscious choices, learning from mistakes, getting better at recognizing red flags. But she'd been repeating the same pattern with increasing precision, unconsciously drawn to men who would recreate her original wound. This is Jung's teaching on complexes, emotionally charged, unconscious psychic structures that autonomously direct behavior. Complexes form around intense experiences, usually in childhood, where significant needs weren't met or where we experienced wounding that couldn't be processed at the time. These complexes remain in the unconscious, carrying the emotional charge of the original experience, and they engineer our adult relationships to recreate the original dynamic. The unconscious purpose is resolution. Your psyche keeps putting you in similar situations, hoping that this time you'll heal what wasn't healed then. But because the complex operates unconsciously, you can't actually resolve anything. You just repeat the pattern, each time hoping for a different outcome, each time experiencing the same wound. Most people spend their entire lives trapped in relationship patterns driven by unconscious complexes. They genuinely believe they're making different choices, choosing different people, learning from experience, but they're unconsciously attracted to partners who will activate their complexes and recreate their original wounds. The faces change, but the dynamics remain identical, and they call it fate, bad luck, or not having met the right person yet. But if you're experiencing this 5th clue, something different has happened. You've seen the pattern. You've traced it to its origin. You've understood the complex driving it, and through conscious psychological work, you've released the template. You're no longer being unconsciously engineered into repetitive dynamics. You're free to choose differently. Let me break down the pattern recognition and release process. First comes repetition blindness. You're completely unconscious that you're repeating anything. Each relationship feels unique. Each person seems different. You're making what you believe are conscious choices based on lessons learned. Yes, you've had relationship failures, but they were about those specific people and circumstances, not about you repeating a pattern. This stage can last decades, a lifetime. Some people never progress beyond it. Second comes vague awareness. Something starts to feel familiar. A new relationship begins having dynamics that remind you of previous ones. A conflict feels like one you've had before. A partner says something that echoes what an ex said. You start having thoughts like, why does this keep happening? Or, I feel like I've been here before. But you can't quite see the full pattern yet. It's more like sensing something beneath the surface without being able to articulate it. Third comes pattern clarity. This is the breakthrough. Sudden recognition that you've been repeating the same relationship over and over. Maybe it comes in therapy, maybe through journaling, maybe through a friend's observation, maybe just through finally having enough data points to see the pattern. You realize, I keep choosing emotionally unavailable partners, or I keep being attracted to narcissists, or I keep abandoning relationships when they get close, or I keep choosing people I need to rescue. The specific pattern varies, but the recognition is the same. I've been doing this repeatedly, unconsciously, and calling it fate. Fourth comes origin investigation. Once you see the pattern, you can trace it backwards. Where did this start? This requires examining your early relationships, particularly with parents or primary caregivers, to understand what wounds, needs, or dynamics are being unconsciously recreated. Jennifer traced her unavailable partner pattern to her alcoholic father. Someone else might trace their rescuer pattern to having a depressed mother they tried to cheer up. Someone else might trace their avoidance of intimacy to having invasive, boundary-violating parents. Fifth comes complex identification. This goes deeper than just recognizing a pattern. It's understanding the psychological complex driving it. A complex isn't just a behavior pattern, it's an autonomous psychic structure with its own emotional charge, its own intelligence, its own agenda. Jung described complexes as having a certain amount of their own life and being able to behave like independent beings. Jennifer's father complex was continuously engineering relationships where she could try to win an unavailable man's consistent presence, unconsciously hoping to finally heal the wound of her father choosing alcohol over her. Sixth comes conscious integration. This is the difficult therapeutic work of processing what wasn't processed in childhood. It means feeling the original wound, really feeling it, allowing the grief and anger and pain that was too much for your child self to handle. It means recognizing that your adult relationships can't heal your childhood wounds. They can only recreate them. It means developing adult capacities to meet needs that weren't met in childhood, so you're not unconsciously seeking parents and partners. This work is painful and takes time, but it's the only path to freedom from repetition compulsion. Seventh comes pattern release. This isn't something you decide or force. It's what naturally emerges from integration work. The complex loses its charge. The pattern loses its compulsive quality. You're no longer unconsciously drawn to the same type of person or dynamic. The template that's been directing your choices dissolves, and suddenly, you're free to choose based on actual compatibility rather than unconscious complex activation. Eighth comes new possibility. This is the gift on the other side of pattern release. You find yourself attracted to completely different people, operating in completely different relationship dynamics, having experiences that don't fit your historical template. Not because you forced yourself to choose differently, but because your unconscious attractions have shifted. You're relating from a different internal structure. Jennifer moved through these stages over 3 years of intensive therapy. The pattern recognition came first, then the painful origin work of examining her relationship with her father, grieving the childhood she'd needed but didn't have, feeling the full weight of abandonment she'd carried for 30 years. She had to face that her father's alcoholism wasn't about her worth, that her child self couldn't have fixed him, that she'd been carrying responsibility for connection that was never hers to carry. As she integrated this material, something shifted in her attraction patterns. She went on a date with a man who was emotionally consistent. No intermittent availability, no pulling away when she got close, no making her work for his attention. And instead of finding him boring, which would have been her previous response to someone without the familiar push-pull dynamic, she found him peaceful, interesting in his stability, attractive in his straightforwardness, The relationship that developed was unlike anything she'd experienced. No anxiety about abandonment, no working to maintain connection, no familiar pattern of pursuit and withdrawal, just two adults choosing each other consistently. It felt strange at first, almost disappointingly calm. But gradually, Jennifer recognized this strangeness for what it was: health. She was experiencing a relationship pattern she'd never had before because she'd released the complex that had been directing all her previous choices. Comment if you recognize your patterns. If you can name the relationship dynamic you keep recreating, if you've traced it to childhood origins, if you've felt the moment when you realized you've been unconsciously repeating the same thing for years or decades. Because pattern recognition is the beginning of freedom. Let me detail the specific relationship complexes that most commonly drive repetition. The father-mother complex. This is the most fundamental. You unconsciously seek to recreate your relationship with your opposite-sex parent or primary caregiver in romantic partnerships. If your father was absent, you choose unavailable men. If your mother was controlling, you choose dominating women. If your father was weak, you choose passive men you need to lead. If your mother was narcissistic, you choose self-absorbed women. The pattern is unconsciously precise. You're not just choosing similar personality types, you're recreating the specific dynamic, including your role in it. The savior complex. You're compulsively drawn to people who need rescuing. Partners with addictions, mental health crises, financial disasters, chronic victimhood. You believe you're being loving, but you're actually unconsciously reenacting childhood dynamics where you tried to save a parent. Maybe you had a depressed mother you tried to cheer up, an alcoholic father you tried to fix, siblings you had to parent. As an adult, you're still trying to earn love through saving others, still believing if you rescue someone well enough, they'll finally give you the devotion your child self needed. The victim complex. You repeatedly find yourself being hurt, betrayed, abandoned, or abused in relationships. And while you consciously want healthy partnership, your unconscious is engineering situations where you experience victimization because that's what's familiar. Maybe you were victimized in childhood by abuse, neglect, or having your needs chronically unmet. Now your psyche recreates this dynamic because it's what you know, and because unconsciously you're hoping someone will finally see your pain and meet your needs. They never do. Victims in adulthood need to rescue themselves. The abandonment complex. You unconsciously engineer situations where you're left. Either you push partners away when they get too close, provoking them to leave so you can control the timing of the inevitable abandonment, or you choose people who are emotionally unavailable, already attached, or commitment phobic. Ensuring abandonment is built into the dynamic. This comes from early abandonment, physical or emotional, that created a core belief that people always leave. Your unconscious recreates this to confirm the belief, providing terrible comfort in predictability. The engulfment complex. The opposite of abandonment. You flee intimacy, sabotage closeness, maintain distance in relationships, not because you don't want love, but because closeness feels threatening to your autonomy and existence. This usually comes from childhood, where boundaries were violated, where parents were intrusive or enmeshed, where you didn't have psychological separation. Now, intimacy feels like obliteration, so you unconsciously choose avoidant partners or become the avoidant one, ensuring relationships never get close enough to trigger your engulfment terror. The unworthiness complex. You unconsciously believe you're unworthy of love, so you choose partners who confirm this. Either you choose people who are cruel, neglectful, or treat you poorly, confirming you don't deserve better. Or you choose partners who are wonderful, then sabotage the relationship because unconsciously you can't tolerate receiving the love you believe you don't deserve. This comes from childhood experiences of conditional love, criticism, abuse, or having your authentic self rejected, creating a core belief that the real you is unlovable. The triangle complex. You repeatedly create or enter triangulated relationships, affairs being the other person, having emotional backup partners, competitive dynamics with rivals for your partner's attention. This comes from unresolved Oedipal dynamics, or families where love was triangulated, competing with a sibling for parental attention, being triangulated into parents' marriage. The pattern gives you the familiar intensity of having to compete for love, while ensuring you never have to face the vulnerability of direct, exclusive intimacy. Jennifer's was a father complex combined with abandonment complex. She was recreating her relationship with her alcoholic father while unconsciously engineering inevitable abandonment to confirm her unworthiness of consistent presence. I need to share my own pattern because recognizing it was devastatingly humbling. I kept choosing partners who were critical, women who had high standards, who constantly identified what I was doing wrong, who made me feel like I was never quite enough. And I would work tirelessly to meet their standards, to become the man they needed, to finally earn full approval. The relationships were exhausting, and they always ended with me feeling like I'd failed some test. In my mid-30s, a therapist helped me see I was recreating my relationship with my mother. She'd been a perfectionist who communicated love through criticism, always pushing me to be better, never quite satisfied with my achievements. I'd spent my childhood trying to earn her unqualified approval, and I was spending my adult life doing the same thing with romantic partners. The origin wound was that I'd internalized a belief that love was conditional on performance, that I needed to constantly improve to deserve affection, that being fully accepted as I wasn't possible. So I unconsciously chose women who would reinforce this dynamic, giving me endless opportunities to try to finally earn unconditional love, which I never did because I was choosing people who couldn't provide it. Seeing this pattern was mortifying. Years of relationships, all following the same template. Years of believing I just kept choosing critical women by bad luck, never recognizing I was unconsciously attracted to that quality because it activated my mother complex. Years of missing potential partners who would have accepted me as I was because they didn't provide the familiar dynamic of having to earn love through performance. The integration work was painful. I had to grieve my childhood experience of love always being conditional, feel the anger at never being accepted fully, acknowledge how that had shaped my entire sense of worth. And I had to develop the capacity to give myself the unconditional acceptance I'd been seeking from others. When the pattern finally released, and I could feel it release like chains falling away, my attraction shifted completely. I found myself drawn to women who were accepting rather than critical, who appreciated me as I was rather than as a project to improve. The first time a partner said, "You're enough exactly as you are," I cried, because I'd never heard that before and because I was finally ready to receive it. Here's the mirror effect. Your partners aren't randomly choosing you, and you're not randomly choosing them. You're unconsciously attracting each other based on compatible complexes. The woman with father abandonment issues attracts men with mother engulfment issues. His unavailability matches her wound. Her pursuit triggers his need to flee. The man with savior complex attracts women with victim complex. Her need for rescue matches his need to be needed. His rescuing enables her victimhood. The patterns interlock with unconscious precision. This means relationship failures aren't just about the other person being wrong for you. They're information about your unhealed complexes seeking resolution. Every partner who disappoints you is showing you what you haven't integrated. Every repetitive dynamic is your unconscious saying, "This is what needs healing." Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." This is exactly what happens with relationship patterns. Your unconscious complexes direct your choices, engineer your dynamics, and create repetitive outcomes. And you call it bad luck, poor judgment, not having met the right person. But it's not fate. It's unconscious psychological structures that can be made conscious, integrated, and released. The work of pattern recognition and release includes mapping your pattern. Write out your significant relationships. For each one, note, how did it begin? What attracted you? What was the dynamic? How did conflicts unfold? How did it end? What was your role? Look for what's consistent across relationships rather than what's different. The pattern is usually strikingly clear once you're willing to see it. Tracing to origin. Once you see your pattern, examine your childhood relationships, particularly with parents. What was your relationship with your mother like? Your father? Were they available or absent? Critical or accepting? Controlling or permissive? Stable or chaotic? Look for where your adult pattern mirrors childhood dynamics. Naming the complex. Identify the psychological complex driving your pattern. Is it father-mother complex, savior complex, victim complex, abandonment, engulfment, unworthiness, triangle? Naming the complex helps you understand that this isn't just behavior. It's an autonomous psychic structure that's been directing your choices. Grieving what was. Pattern release requires emotional integration of childhood wounds. This means feeling what you couldn't feel then. Grief for the parent you needed but didn't have. Anger at needs that went unmet. Sadness at the child who had to develop compensatory strategies to survive. This grief work is essential. You can't release a pattern without processing the wound that created it. Developing new capacities. Part of pattern release is developing adult capacities to meet needs that weren't met in childhood. If you were abandoned, learning to self-soothe and provide internal security. If you were criticized, learning self-acceptance and unconditional self-regard. If you were controlled, learning autonomy and self-direction. If you were neglected, learning self-care and self-prioritization. Noticing when the pattern tries to reassert. Even after significant integration work, your complex will sometimes try to reactivate. You'll feel attracted to someone who fits your old pattern, or you'll find yourself falling into familiar dynamics. The difference post-integration is that you catch it quickly. You notice, this is my old pattern. This person activates my father complex. This dynamic recreates my childhood wound. And you can choose differently, choosing consciously. Pattern release means your choices are no longer being unconsciously directed. You're attracted to people based on actual compatibility rather than complex activation. You can assess, does this person actually align with my values, life goals, and authentic needs? Or am I attracted because they activate a familiar wound? This conscious choosing is freedom. Jennifer, 3 years into her new relationship with the emotionally consistent man, reflects on how different this is from everything before. There's no anxiety, no pursuing, no working to maintain connection, no familiar abandonment wound being activated. It feels almost suspiciously easy because she's relating from a healed place rather than an unconscious wound. She says, I spent 20 years choosing unavailable men, believing I just kept meeting the wrong people. I didn't understand I was unconsciously drawn to unavailability because it activated my father complex, giving me endless chances to try to win consistent love from someone who couldn't provide it. I thought I was being unlucky. I was actually being unconsciously precise in recreating my original wound. Breaking that pattern required facing the grief I'd been avoiding since childhood, that my father chose addiction over being present for me, and there was nothing I could have done to change that. Once I processed that grief, the pattern just dissolved. I wasn't attracted to unavailable men anymore. I could finally see and choose consistent presence, because I wasn't unconsciously seeking to resolve an unresolvable childhood wound. If you've done this work, if you've recognized your patterns, traced them to their origins, named your complexes, grieved your childhood wounds, and felt the pattern release, you're ready for higher love. Because you're no longer being unconsciously driven into repetitive dynamics. You're no longer trying to heal childhood wounds through adult relationships. You're choosing consciously rather than being chosen by your unconscious. This is the fifth clue. The prison of repetition has been escaped. You're free to create something new. The transformation continues. Let's discover what else you've become capable of. There's a level of intimacy that most relationships never reach, not because people don't try, but because they're incapable of it. I'm not talking about physical intimacy or even emotional vulnerability, sharing feelings, expressing affection, having deep conversations. I'm talking about something Jung called psychological relationship, where both people show up with their full psyches visible, where shadows can be present without shame, where wounds can be revealed without rescue, where each person can witness the other's complete complexity without merging, defending, or fleeing. This level of intimacy requires ego strength that most people never develop. The sixth clue that your soul is ready for higher love is that this capacity has emerged in you. You're no longer defensive in the way you used to be. You can reveal your darkness without being destroyed by shame. You can hold space for another person's full humanity, their contradictions, their wounds, their shadows, their unfinished psychological material, without needing to fix, rescue, or run. You can be truly known and still be present. You can truly know another and still choose them. Let me tell you about Daniel and Emma. They met at 42, both having been through extensive therapy, both having done years of shadow work and pattern recognition. Their relationship unfolded in a way that would have been impossible for their younger selves. On their fifth date, Daniel shared something he'd never told a romantic partner. I need you to know that I have what my therapist calls a narcissistic wound, not full NPD, but a core injury around worthiness that makes me constantly seek validation. When we're together, part of me is performing, trying to be impressive enough that you'll stay interested. I catch myself doing it, and I hate it, but it's there. And I want you to know because I don't want to hide it from you. Emma felt something shift in her chest, not repulsion or concern, but recognition and respect, because she'd done enough work to understand that what Daniel was sharing wasn't a confession seeking absolution. It was psychological intimacy. He was revealing his internal structure, his wound, his pattern, trusting her to witness it without judgment or rescue. She responded, I appreciate you telling me that. I notice it sometimes, the performance quality, and I want you to know about my own structure. I have an anxious attachment pattern that my therapist and I have been working on for years. When you don't text back quickly or when you seem distant, there's a part of me that goes into panic mode, creating narratives about you losing interest. I've learned to manage it, to self-soothe rather than make it your problem. But it's there, and I want you to know what's happening in my internal world when it gets activated. This exchange might seem strange from a conventional dating perspective. Why reveal your psychological wounds so early? Why not present your best self? Maintain the romantic mystery. Wait until you're more secure in the relationship. But Daniel and Emma weren't operating conventionally. They were practicing psychological intimacy, revealing their internal structures, wounds, and patterns, not as problems to be solved, but as aspects of their full humanity to be known. Over the following year, their relationship deepened into territories neither had experienced before. When Daniel's narcissistic wound was activated, when he felt dismissed or unimportant and went into validation-seeking mode, Emma could witness it without taking it personally. She understood it was his wound speaking, not truth about her regard for him. She could hold space for his insecurity without needing to constantly reassure or manage his feelings. When Emma's anxious attachment was triggered, when Daniel needed time alone and her abandonment fears erupted, Daniel could stay present without becoming defensive or withdrawing further. He understood it was her wound being activated, not reality about his commitment. He could provide reassurance without feeling controlled by her anxiety. They shared dreams and their analysis. They discussed each other's complexes with curiosity rather than judgment. They reflected each other's shadows with compassion rather than condemnation. They supported each other's continued individuation, even when it created temporary discomfort in the relationship. They revealed fears, shame, contradictions, all the material most people hide to maintain their acceptable self-image, and they held space for each other's full psychological complexity. This is psychological intimacy, and it's radically different from what most people mean by intimacy. Let me break down the distinction. Emotional intimacy is sharing feelings. I feel sad, I feel angry, I feel hurt. This is important and valuable, but it's surface level compared to psychological intimacy. Emotional intimacy can exist without much self-awareness or integration. You can share feelings without understanding the psychological structures generating them. Psychological intimacy is revealing psyche. Your internal structures, wounds, complexes, shadows, defenses, patterns. I have an abandonment wound that makes me push people away when they get close. I have a savior complex that drives me to rescue people. I have a shadow quality of cruelty that emerges when I feel threatened. I have a father complex that makes me seek critical partners. This level of revelation requires extensive self-knowledge and integration. You can't reveal what you haven't made conscious. Most relationships operate at the level of emotional intimacy. People share their feelings, support each other emotionally, provide comfort and validation. This creates connection and warmth, but it doesn't create the depth of psychological relationship, the conscious union between two people who know themselves deeply and can therefore know each other deeply. Psychological intimacy requires several prerequisites that most people never develop. First, strong ego structure. You need to know who you are with enough stability that revealing your wounds, shadows, and complexes doesn't fragment you. If your sense of self is fragile, psychological intimacy is too threatening. You'll hide, defend, or present curated versions of yourself. But if you've done individuation work, if you have what Jung called a strong ego, you can reveal your full psyche without falling apart. You know yourself well enough that being seen completely doesn't threaten your existence. Second, integrated shadow. You need to have faced, acknowledged, and integrated your darkness so that revealing it doesn't overwhelm you with shame. If you're still denying your shadow, psychological intimacy is impossible because there are aspects of yourself that must remain hidden. But if you've integrated your shadow, if you've accepted your capacity for manipulation, cruelty, selfishness, dishonesty, you can reveal these aspects without being destroyed by self-judgment. You can say, I'm capable of this darkness, without needing reassurance that you're still good. Third, emotional regulation. You need to be able to manage your own emotional states without requiring your partner to regulate them for you. If you're emotionally dysregulated, unable to self-soothe, depending on others to manage your feelings, psychological intimacy becomes extractive rather than mutual. You're constantly needing your partner to reassure, validate, or contain your emotions. But if you've developed emotional sovereignty, the capacity to feel, tolerate, and manage your full range of emotions, you can share your internal experience without making it your partner's job to fix. Fourth, non-reactive presence. You need to be able to witness your partner's psychological material without merging with it, defending against it, or trying to fix it. If you're highly reactive, getting triggered by their wounds, taking their patterns, personally needing to rescue them from discomfort, psychological intimacy is impossible. You can't hold space for someone else's full humanity if you're constantly reacting to it. But if you've developed the capacity for witnessing presence, staying grounded in yourself while holding space for another's complexity, you can receive psychological revelation without making it about you. Fifth, commitment to truth over comfort. You need to prioritize honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. Most relationships prioritize comfort, avoiding difficult conversations, maintaining pleasant interactions, not disturbing the peace with psychological revelation. But psychological intimacy requires valuing truth above comfort. It means being willing to share what's actually happening internally, even when it would be easier to hide it, and being willing to hear what your partner reveals, even when it challenges your narrative. Sixth, tolerance for paradox. You need to be able to hold contradictions without needing to resolve them into simple categories. Psychological intimacy means accepting that your partner is both loving and capable of cruelty, both generous and selfish, both strong and wounded. Most people split. They need partners to be all good or all bad, and they can't tolerate complexity. But holding psychological intimacy means embracing paradox, accepting that everyone contains opposites, that humans are psychologically complex rather than simple. Daniel and Emma developed these capacities over years of individual work before they met each other. Daniel had spent his 30s in therapy working on his narcissistic wound, integrating his shadow, developing emotional regulation. Emma had done similar work on her anxious attachment, her people-pleasing patterns, her tendency to abandon herself in relationships. When they met, both were capable of psychological intimacy, not perfectly, but fundamentally. And this created a relationship operating at a completely different level than either had experienced. Comment below if you've experienced this shift, if you can feel the difference between surface emotional sharing and deep psychological revelation, if you've been in a relationship where both people could show their full psyches without defense. Because this capacity is rare and it's what creates sacred union. Let me show you what becomes possible in psychological relationship. You share dreams and explore their meanings together. Not just casually mentioning a dream, but actually working with dream material as valuable psychological information. Daniel has a recurring dream of being in a house with rooms he's never explored, feeling both curious and terrified to open the doors. He shares this with Emma, and they explore together what it might mean. Undiscovered aspects of his psyche, fear of what he'll find in his unconscious, the individuation process calling him to explore. Emma doesn't dismiss it as just a dream or offer superficial interpretations. She holds the dream with respect, helping him investigate what his psyche is communicating. You discuss each other's complexes with curiosity. Emma recognizes that she has a mother complex. She's unconsciously seeking maternal approval from authority figures, including aspects of that dynamic with Daniel. She can say this out loud. I notice I'm acting out my mother complex with you, seeking reassurance that I'm good enough, making myself small to not be too much. And Daniel doesn't take this personally or feel burdened by it. He's curious. What does that feel like when it gets activated? What do you need from me in those moments? How can I support you in seeing it clearly without enabling it? You reflect each other's shadows compassionately. Daniel notices Emma manipulating a situation to get her way, using tears strategically to avoid direct confrontation. In most relationships, this would either go unaddressed, avoiding conflict, or become an argument, attacking the manipulation. But Daniel can reflect what he sees without judgment. I notice you're crying right now, and I'm wondering if part of that is Strategic, a way to get me to back down without having to directly assert what you want. Emma could become defensive, but she's done enough shadow work to acknowledge, "You're right, I do that. It's my shadow manipulation, and I'm still working on asking directly for what I need instead." You support each other's continued individuation even when it's uncomfortable. Emma decides she wants to spend a month on a solo retreat for deep internal work. This triggers Daniel's abandonment fears and narcissistic wound. Part of him interprets it as rejection, as her not needing him enough. But he can name what's getting activated. Your retreat is triggering my wound, the part of me that needs to feel essential to you. But I recognize that's my issue, not yours. I support your need for solitude and growth, even though it's uncomfortable for my wound. And Emma can hold both truths. She loves him, and she needs time alone for her own development. The relationship doesn't require fusion or constant togetherness. You reveal fears without expecting rescue. Daniel shares his deep fear of being unlovable beneath all his performance, the terror that if Emma truly saw him, she'd leave. In most relationships, this would trigger a cycle of reassurance. "Of course I love you. Of course you're lovable. Don't worry." But Emma understands that constantly reassuring actually enables the wound, so she responds differently. "I hear that fear, and I imagine it's very real for you. What would it be like to sit with that fear without needing me to make it go away? What if you could tolerate the uncertainty of whether I'll stay without needing constant proof?" This is more challenging than rescue, but it's also more respectful. It treats Daniel as capable of holding his own fear rather than needing to be saved from it. You hold space for each other's darkness without being destroyed. Emma has moments of profound rage at her mother, at society, at systems of oppression, at injuries personal and collective. When this rage surfaces, it's intense and sometimes frightening. Daniel's instinct used to be to soothe, to calm, to make the rage go away because it was uncomfortable for him, but he's learned to hold space for it. Your rage is valid. I can be present with it. You don't need to suppress it to make me comfortable. And Emma can express her full fury without Daniel withdrawing or becoming afraid, which allows the rage to move through rather than getting suppressed. You make room for the relationship itself to be a growth edge. They recognize that conflicts aren't problems to be solved, but information about what's unconscious. When they have a fight about Daniel spending too much time at work, they don't just negotiate schedules. They investigate. What's this conflict revealing? For Daniel, his overwork is avoiding intimacy, because closeness activates his fear of being truly known. For Emma, her complaint about his absence is avoiding her own need to develop autonomous interests. The conflict becomes a portal into deeper self-knowledge for both. This is psychological intimacy in action. It's not comfortable. It's not always romantic in the conventional sense. It's challenging, confronting, and requires both people to continually face aspects of themselves they'd prefer to avoid. But it creates a depth of connection that's impossible in relationships operating at surface levels. I need to share my own experience because psychological intimacy was something I actively avoided for years while believing I was good at intimacy. I prided myself on emotional availability. I could talk about feelings, provide support, have vulnerable conversations, but I was sharing curated emotions while hiding my actual psychological structures. I never revealed my narcissistic shadow, my need for admiration, my covert manipulation tactics. I never shared my deepest fears because that felt too exposing. I never discussed my complexes because that seemed like making my issues my partner's problem. I maintained what I thought was healthy boundaries but was actually defensive protection against being truly known. The shift happened in my late 30s with a partner who had done extensive Jungian analysis. She started sharing her dreams, discussing her mother complex, acknowledging her shadow patterns, and she invited me to do the same, not with pressure, but with genuine curiosity about my internal world. At first, I was resistant. It felt too exposing, too raw, too much like admitting I was more psychologically wounded and complex than I wanted her to know. But gradually, I began sharing more authentically. I told her about my performance pattern, my validation seeking, my covert narcissism. I revealed my father complex, my wound around criticism, my shadow cruelty. I shared dreams and explored what they might mean about my unconscious. And something miraculous happened. Instead of being repelled or burdened, she became more interested, more connected, more capable of loving the real me rather than my curated version. The relationship reached depths I'd never experienced. We could discuss our patterns without blame. We could acknowledge our shadows without shame. We could support each other's growth even when it temporarily created distance. We held each other's psychological complexity with respect, rather than trying to simplify each other into manageable categories. When that relationship eventually ended, for reasons related to life circumstances rather than psychological incompatibility, I couldn't go back to surface-level intimacy. I'd experienced psychological relationship, and anything less felt inauthentic. I became willing to be single rather than pretend I didn't have the complexity I'd discovered in myself. Here's the mirror effect. The level of psychological intimacy you can hold in relationship directly reflects the level of self-knowledge you've developed. If you don't know your own psyche deeply, your complexes, wounds, shadows, patterns, you can't reveal it to others. If you're defending against your own psychological material, you'll need your partner to do the same. But if you've done deep internal work, if you know yourself psychologically, if you've integrated enough to be with your full humanity, then you can invite another person into genuine psychological intimacy, and you attract partners capable of meeting you at that level. People who haven't done internal work are drawn to surface relationships. People who've done shallow work are drawn to emotional intimacy, but people who've done deep psychological work recognize each other. They're attracted to the possibility of being fully known and fully knowing another. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he understood that transformation only happens when both substances are properly prepared. If one or both people can't tolerate psychological intimacy, they might have a relationship, but they won't have the transformative reaction he described. Psychological intimacy creates transformation because nothing remains hidden. Your partner sees your shadows and loves you anyway. You witness their wounds and choose them regardless. Both people are continuously challenged to grow because the relationship reflects everything that's unconscious. The mirror is constant and unrelenting, but if both people are committed to consciousness over comfort, this becomes the greatest gift. Daniel and Emma use their relationship as a consciousness practice. They've explicitly agreed that the relationship's purpose isn't just companionship or emotional support, it's mutual awakening. They're using their partnership to become more conscious, more integrated, more fully themselves. This means being willing to have uncomfortable conversations, to point out each other's unconscious patterns, to hold space for difficult psychological material. 3 years into their relationship, they have a conversation that illustrates this. Daniel, I need to tell you something I'm noticing. When we're with your friends, you become a different person, more performative, less authentic. It's like you're playing a role of who you think they need you to be, and I find myself feeling disconnected from you when you do that. In most relationships, this would trigger defensiveness. I'm not being inauthentic, I'm just adapting to social context. Why are you criticizing how I am with my friends? but Emma has developed capacity for psychological intimacy. Emma, you're right, I do that. It's my people-pleasing pattern, the part of me that believes I need to be whoever others need me to be loved. I've worked on it a lot, but it still shows up, especially with old friends who knew me before I did this work. Thank you for reflecting it. It helps me see it more clearly. Daniel, I appreciate you hearing that, and I should acknowledge, part of why I'm so sensitive to your performance is because I'm performing constantly. When I point it out in you, I'm also seeing my own pattern. Emma, what if we both practiced being more authentic tonight when we're with them? Not as a performance of authenticity, but just showing up more as we actually are? Daniel, that terrifies me, which probably means it's exactly what I need to do. This exchange demonstrates psychological intimacy, naming patterns without blame, receiving reflection without defense, acknowledging shared shadows, supporting each other's growth into more authentic expression. It's the kind of conversation that's impossible without both people having done significant internal work and developed capacity to hold psychological complexity. If you've developed this capacity, if you can reveal your psyche without fragmenting, if you can witness another's full complexity without rescuing or fleeing, if you can prioritize truth over comfort, if you can hold paradox and contradiction, you're ready for higher love. Because sacred union requires this level of intimacy. The Coniunctio Jung described isn't possible between defended egos, maintaining curated versions of themselves. It requires two people who've become psychologically visible to themselves and can therefore become visible to each other. This is the sixth clue. The capacity for psychological intimacy has emerged. You can be truly known, and you can truly know another. You're prepared for the depth of connection that transforms both people because both people are willing to be seen completely. The preparation continues to deepen. Let's discover what else you've become capable of.